It's really not necessary to make such a formal entry, but unfortunately, if I had to climb up from down there, it would not be pretty. It is my delight to welcome you all here this afternoon for this 34th Annual Economic Outlook Conference. Having been at the school now for almost a year, one of the things that surprised me when I got here was the tremendous work that was done at this school for the state of South Carolina. I, of course, from another university that is also the flagship. And I don't remember once in the 14 years that I was at UNC Chapel Hill's business school that we had a conference on what was going on in the state of North Carolina. So I think it was an absolute testimony and tribute to this institution that this event and people like Joey and Doug and others are here every year advising you about the economic conditions of our state. I have been told to tell both Joey and Doug that you have very high expectations here this afternoon, to the point that a couple of you came to me and said, well, all our budgets are dependent upon what is said here today. And somebody else said to me that I want the meaning of life to 2 decimal points. And Joey said to me he can make 3. So I'm kind of hoping that you will really have a good afternoon here this afternoon. The Darla School of Business is, of course, very proud to be entrusted with what is certainly a great responsibility, which is really a carefully crafted, academically rigorous examination of economic data and marketplace trends, policies, and business practices from both the public and private sectors, locally, nationally, and internationally, in order that we can bring to your analyses and that you can rely on what the marketplace anticipates holds in store for us for the coming year. This is a very serious responsibility. Moreover, in addition to projections for the South Carolinian economy and the national and global trends that have a direct impact on the state and our businesses are also covered. You will be hearing from 3 experts with exceptionally well-informed insights on manufacturing, housing, and the financial markets. I should at least at this point, before I introduce our first speaker, Joey, on behalf of the Darla School of Business, thank our 3 sponsors for this event here this afternoon. That would be Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, SCRA Technology Ventures, and South State Bank. I think a round of applause for our sponsors is not a bad idea. It is finally my greatest pleasure to introduce our first speaker of this afternoon. He has promised to go to 3 decimal points, and I'm going to watch and see if he climbs up. No, you see, he'll just appear magically from the other side. Many of you know him already, both in person and by reputation. He has carved out quite a presence as a researcher and speaker here in South Carolina. Dr. Joseph C. von Nessen, or as I call and you all call him Joey, is a research economist in the Division of Research here at the Moore School, where he conducts economic impact analyses, forecasts, survey research, and other applied work involving regional economic modeling. And that doesn't even begin to cover it. I'm actually going to get him in here because I want him to hear this in person. You can stand with me as I introduce you.
Okay.
Joey specializes in housing economics and residential real estate, something I have only recently discovered, which I'm really mad about, because we bought a house here and you think I had the brightness to go and ask him about it. Didn't. But the breadth of topics that he and his colleagues in our Department of Research investigate is astounding. In the 7 years that Joey has served in our Department of Research, he has authored dozens of economic analyses for public and private clients, as well as for the university and for our school. He has produced important and insightful examinations of state government operations and policies. He has covered research on healthcare, education, transportation, on law, agriculture, tourism, for the military, manufacturing, and service industries. He's also done research for environmental groups. He has also provided economic impact analyses and market research for clients ranging from Blue Cross Blue Shield to Sunoco to Sparwar, I hope I pronounced that correct, and many NGOs and industry associations. Most recently, Joey collaborated with Doug Woodward, the Moore School's Director of Research, on a report that examines in detail the economic impact of BMW's presence and expansion in the state of South Carolina. In a few minutes, you'll be hearing from Doug the results of this research. But first up, Joey is going to present our 34th annual economic forecast. And I'm sure you'd all like me to stop, get out the way here now, so that we can all be told to the third decimal point what is going to happen in 2015. Joey, you're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here. I'm going to step out and so I can sort of approach and get out from behind the podium, I should say. It's very great to be here this afternoon. We're really excited and thrilled that all of you could be here to be part of this 34th Economic Outlook Conference. We're really excited to be here for really a new era of the Moore School of Business in a new building and really setting the stage for moving South Carolina ahead. So today I want to focus my comments, of course, on the South Carolina Economic Outlook for 2015, what we expect to see going forward. So first, we'll set the stage by looking at what's been happening in 2014 and over the last several years since our current expansion began, and then turn and look at what we expect to happen going forward in 2015. To summarize succinctly what we've been seeing over the last year, South Carolina's economy is very stable. We've seen very stable growth over the last year, but it's also been shifting. Stable but shifting. Stable in the sense that we've seen very consistent growth throughout 2014, and South Carolina has really hit its stride in terms of overall growth patterns, but shifting at the same time, meaning that even though we've seen consistent growth statewide, if we look within the state regionally and we look across industries, we've seen some changing patterns in 2014 that are relatively new, that we haven't seen prior to that between 2010 and 2013 during the early part of this expansion period. So that's what I want to focus on today. So starting out, let's look at the stability. Let me give you some evidence for both of these terms, but starting out with the stability that we've seen in South Carolina over the last year. This gives us a picture of employment growth going back to 2005, and we focus on employment growth first because it's the single best indicator that we have for overall economic activity. It gives us the best proxy for what's going on and the health of our marketplace. And this tracks it back to 2005, January of 2005. And I draw your attention to the two circles there, one on the left and one on the right. The one on the left highlights the 3 years of growth between 2005, or rather 2 years of growth between 2005 and 2007 leading up to the Great Recession. And you can see that our employment growth rate hovered very closely to 2%, with some variation there, but for the most part, right around 2%. If we look and compare that to what's been happening over the last 12 months, which is the circle on the right, what do you notice? We've seen a very similar growth pattern, very tightly compressed right around that 2% line. And many of you who were here last year probably recall us talking about how we were beginning to see South Carolina get to a point of genuine expansion. And we talked about how we're moving beyond this notion of recovery, the language of recovery, and we can begin to talk about a genuine expansion because by many economic metrics, we're seeing growth patterns that are more compatible with a normal expansion, and we've seen a recovery that's really broken through that pre-recession barrier. And so we've continued to see that throughout this year. Again, a very steady, stable rate of 2% employment growth. We can zoom in on that a little bit and just concentrate on what's been happening since 2010. And once again, you see the pattern, very stable growth between 2013 and 2014, where it has stabilized after consistently increasing since 2010 when we began to see positive employment growth following the Great Recession. Another way that we can look at stability in South Carolina is if we look at momentum changes at the state level and at the regional level, what's been happening. So a way to get some perspective here is to look at the long-run average growth compared to short-run growth patterns. So this black line here represents 2% employment growth, which is what we've seen over the last 12 months in South Carolina. We can compare that to this blue line, which represents a rolling 3-month average, which gives us a shorter-term focus. So if we see that in the last 3-month period, we've seen more growth than we've seen over the last year overall, then we're gaining momentum because we're seeing more growth relative to a longer run average. By contrast, if we see a rolling 3-month average, that most recent period of 3-month employment growth is lower than what we've seen over the last year, then we're losing momentum because the most recent period is lower than what we've seen in that historical average. So if we compare that blue line and how it hovers around the black, what you can see, it's been very tightly compacted around that long run average. Once again, pointing to economic stability and consistency, certainly, over the last 12 months. Now, has that been true across the state if we look within areas of South Carolina? And the answer is no. This is where we've begun to see some shifting, both at a geographic level and at an industry level, and we'll go through both of those. This is a map of South Carolina that looks at employment growth over the last 4 years. The counties highlighted in dark green, represent areas that have been growing at the highest rates over the last 4 years. Notice that the growth is primarily concentrated in the upstate, in Greenville, Spartanburg, and Anderson, also down in the Charleston Tri-County region, and there's been some spillover from Charlotte as well. So we see York County in particular, the Rock Hill area, clustered around Charlotte. A lot of that spillover effect there. But primarily, if we break it down, we see the upstate and Charleston being the leaders of our employment growth overall over the last 4 years. Now, this should come as no surprise because manufacturing has been the predominant generator of employment over the last 4 years, anchored around our strong automotive supply chain in Greenville, with BMW at the center there, and also with an emerging aerospace supply chain anchored by Boeing down in Charleston. So that's been growing at the most aggressive rates over the last 4 years, and we're seeing that here in Greenville and in Charleston. Now let's compare this to what's been happening over the last year. So this looks at October of 2010 through 2014. What if we restricted and just look over the last 12 months? What does the picture look like? Is it very similar, or is it quite different? Well, here's what it looks like if we just focus on the last 12 months. Now, this, in a sense, is more positive because we've seen every county with positive employment growth in the last year, whereas if we look at all 4 years, that's not the case. But of greater note is to notice the pattern of these green counties, the ones that have been growing at the highest rate. Notice that the growth is clustering more towards the east of the state. We're sort of shifting to the east. Growth is shifting from Greenville, Spartanburg over to the PD region, specifically in Myrtle Beach, concentrated in and around Myrtle Beach. Similarly, and to a lesser extent, from the Charleston Tri-County area, moving east, moving to the Myrtle Beach region. So what's happening here? Why are we seeing this shift in growth patterns? Well, the primary reason we're seeing this is because leisure and hospitality has been really strong over the last year. The leisure and hospitality sector has been booming, and it has overall generated the most jobs of any sector in South Carolina. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but that correlates very nicely with why we're seeing Myrtle Beach be the major generator of employment over the last year in 2014. We can also see this if we go back to our momentum charts again. I'm going to quickly flip through a momentum graph for each major region of the state. We're going to start with the northwest of the state, so Greenville, Spartanburg, and we're going to move through the Midlands and then towards the east. Notice how the momentum is either flat or slightly negative in the upstate and in Columbia, and it flattens out and it begins to increase as we move east. So here's Greenville, fairly flat, right around that long-run average. Spartanburg, slight decline. Anderson, slight decline. Columbia, fairly flat. Sumter, fairly flat. And then as we move east into Florence, Myrtle Beach, and Charleston, we get an uptick in recent momentum patterns. So once again, we're seeing that growth is beginning to shift eastward, away from Greenville, away from, to a lesser extent, away from Charleston. Again, we've seen some recent increases there, but predominantly right around and concentrated in the Myrtle Beach region. Here are some numbers to put with that. I mentioned before, we've seen about 2% employment growth over the last year. again, depending on the specific point of comparison that we look at. And you can see that Myrtle Beach has been the clear leader at 4% over the last year, about twice the rate of the state average. The second is at Greenville, right at 2.5%. And contrast that for what we saw between 2014 and 2010. Still a fairly high rate of growth, regardless of what period we look at. We've seen close to 2% growth overall, but the two top regions of the state, Spartanburg and Anderson, very different from the growth patterns that we've seen over the last year. Again, a lot of that due to the leisure and hospitality sector. But where else is it coming from? Is it just leisure and hospitality, or are we seeing other new trends begin to emerge in South Carolina as well? Well, let's go over those specifically. Over the last 4 years, there have been about 141,000 jobs that have been created in South Carolina. And so the natural question is, all right, we know where geographically they've been. Where have they been in terms of industry? Which industries have been generating these jobs? Have things changed in the last 12 months? And as I've already alluded to, they have somewhat. So let's look at where they've changed. This gives us a picture of the top 5 major industries in South Carolina in terms of their contribution to total employment growth. These are the top 5. The blue bar on the left represents the contribution to total employment growth between 2010 and 2014. The red bar represents what we've seen in the last 12 months. And so what we're looking for are significant changes in any of these industries. Which ones are contributing more, a lot more, or a lot less today in this past year than it has overall over the last 4 years? Can we see any patterns emerging or anything new to look at that points us to what we've been seeing in terms of growth? Well, there are 2 that are positive here. One is leisure and hospitality. And I've already addressed that briefly, but why is leisure and hospitality the major generator of jobs this year? Well, the primary reason, there are several, has to do with consumer spending. Consumers are in a much better financial position today than they have been at any time since 2008. Household net worth is up, disposable income is up, and that's leading to more demand in leisure and hospitality. It's leading to more demand in tourism, which is a huge benefit for South Carolina, and particularly on the coastal region. Housing is a part of this. We've seen now for several years house prices increasing. That's leading to more household net worth because consumers and households are able to see an increase in their net worth as house prices rise. And consumers are also in better positions regarding their debt because they've had an opportunity to refinance with very low interest rates. So there have been several reasons why we've seen consumers emerge in a better financial position today than they have been, again, since any time since 2008. That's stimulating this industry, and we're seeing more and more employment growth that's arising from leisure and hospitality generally. The other area, and the one that's really has seen a sizable increase in its contribution, is the professional and business services sector. Now, this is somewhat vague. This is a fairly large sector, so it's useful to drill down in there and see what's going on. Why are we seeing such a huge increase? And it turns out that the increase is coming from the employment services sector. Now, one way to look at this is if we look at the percentage of employment growth that is contributed by the employment services sector. And it turns out that this has been increasing, and that increase has been it's been increasing at an increasing rate. And we can see that here. So between 2003 and 2007, I draw your attention to the red bar here. What this is telling us is that between 2003 and 2007 in South Carolina, about 6.8 out of every 100 jobs, 6.8 were created in the employment services sector in South Carolina. Between 2010 and 2014, that number jumped to 13.6 out of every 100 jobs created were in the employment services sector. Over the last year, it's increased to 32.4%. So 32.4 jobs out of every 100 were created in the employment services sector. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that employment services is becoming more and more a disproportionately large generator of the employment gains that we're seeing in South Carolina. And it's not just South Carolina. This is not a South Carolina trend uniquely so. We're seeing this throughout the country. On the right, you can see the U.S. trends. We've also looked at it in states across the Southeast and elsewhere as well. And so this is a trend at the national level. If we look at similar patterns, again, at the national level between 2003 and 2007, out of every 100 jobs created On average, about 1 was created in the employment services sector, and that's jumped to about 10% over the last year. So again, South Carolina is near the top of the pack if we actually rank the states, but this is certainly a national trend. It's not uniquely South Carolina. And so the question becomes why? What's going on here? What's new about 2014 that caused this major upswing? Well, I think one of the things that's happening is we're seeing a potential shift in business hiring practices. Normally, we tend to see employment services increase as a share of employment growth, as we've been seeing in the early part of an expansion period. That is perfectly normal. We've seen that in most recovery periods. But what happens is that employers, initially relying on employment services, which are specifically defined as employment staffing firms, temporary staffing firms, and contract labor, because employers are relying on this more because they're not sure whether or not the demand that they're seeing is going to last for a long period of time. And labor costs tend to be the highest for most employers. So in the early part of a recovery, when you're seeing more demand, you're seeing more economic activity, you want to go out and hire, you want to invest, you want to expand, but if you're uncertain as to whether that demand is going to last, you're going to be more cautious and more restrictive. However, as the economic recovery takes hold, it turns into a more robust expansion. Businesses then tend to turn back to their more traditional hiring patterns. And we see employment services as a percentage of employment growth overall begin to retract a bit. That second stage is what we haven't seen in this particular recovery in South Carolina or in many other states as well. And so one of the things that's happening is that employers are seeing this as a long-term hiring model, as sustainable and as usable, and so they're not moving back to the more traditional hiring pattern that they had in the past. The other aspect of this, the other cause, is that there is still relatively high uncertainty across the country and in South Carolina relative to what we might otherwise expect to see. With the end of quantitative easing and Fed policy changing, we've seen more fluctuations in worldwide markets. We've seen problems politically with the debt ceiling and other issues between the Congress and the President getting together. So a lot of things going on that create more uncertainty. And uncertainty in general creates paralysis, both from a business perspective, who are more cautious about looking to invest and hire, and from a consumer perspective, when they're more wary about spending. And that's why we're seeing, again, more spending this year, is because consumers are seeing increases in confidence and having more disposable income. So we want to get uncertainty down, and to the extent that it remains high, we see less activity, all things being equal. So now let's look ahead. These are the major trends that we've seen in 2014 develop in South Carolina. Let's move on and talk about what we expect for 2015. And the natural question is, given that we've seen such consistent growth in 2014, what can we expect going ahead? Is employment growth expected to increase significantly? Is it reasonable that since we've seen 2% growth over the last year, we might see 2.5% or even 3% growth in South Carolina going forward? Well, while we're fairly optimistic this year, and we expect 2015 will show continued rates of growth along what we've seen in 2014, there are at least 3 reasons that I think that growth significantly above 2% is probably not realistic, at least in the short run, in 2015. And here are the primary reasons why. Number one, I've mentioned general uncertainty. As I said, there have been a lot of exogenous or external changes going on that have really kept uncertainty somewhat high. I've mentioned what those are. And again, uncertainty tends to lead to paralysis, both from a business standpoint and from a consumer standpoint. And we're still seeing a lot of that right now in markets across the world. Secondly, there's no South Carolina industry currently in rapid expansion. So when we look to see 2.5% or 3% growth in South Carolina, the question becomes, well, where's it going to come from? It's got to come from a particular industry. And if we look over the past 4 years, between 2010 and 2014, what we find is that manufacturing has been where those really high rates of growth are. If we look in Greenville and in Charleston, we see growth rates of between 8 and 10% during some periods over the last 4 years in manufacturing. Very, very much higher than we've seen for the state average, which again has been 2% at best. So we're looking for other industries. Which industries are going to see these high rates of growth? Those are going to be the ones that can drive us to have a statewide average of 2.5 or 3% and generate more overall economic activity at the state level. And right now we're not seeing that. We're seeing more stable growth, but not at those levels in certain industries that we've seen over the last several years. Reason number 3 comes down to what's been happening internationally, markets in Europe. As you are probably aware, we've seen very low rates of growth, particularly in the Eurozone during the third quarter, and there is some concern that that will continue into 2015. So if Europe's growth stays low, or if Europe goes into a recession, that can affect the U.S. and specifically South Carolina, because we are ranked near the top among all states in terms of the export activity that we have to Europe as a percentage of our GDP. So said another way, if we look at all states and we look at the percentage of exports to Europe out of each state, then we rank close to the top among all states, which is generally a good thing because it means we're more interconnected with international markets, with the global economy, with the European economy. But it also means that we're more vulnerable to being hit in a negative way when we see a global slowdown, or particularly a slowdown in European markets, which right now we're a bit concerned about. So for those 3 reasons, again, we're expecting more stable growth in 2015, but we're looking right now to expect that it will be very similar to what we've seen in 2014. So I've said as sort of a shorthand, if you like 2014, then you're going to like 2015 as well, because we're going to see very similar growth patterns. So 2% growth is what we've seen over the last year. Our forecast projects 1.9% for an annual average for the next 12 months. What else can we say about 2015 and what to expect going forward? We can also look at the unemployment picture. What's happening in unemployment in South Carolina? And one way to look at that is to get a sense of what's been happening with the South Carolina labor force, because of course the labor force is a major component of the unemployment rate and how it's calculated. Now, you may have noticed that we've seen a huge fluctuation in the unemployment rate over the last year. We saw a major decline. We got below the national average, and it's been rising significantly since the summer months. So what's going on here? Well, this is what's driving it. What's driving it are changes in the labor force. And you can see that in the second half of 2014, we've seen a major increase in the size of the labor force, which has outpaced the growth in total employment. So we have more people entering the labor force out looking for work, and they're now considered unemployed temporarily while they look for a job, so that boosts our unemployment rate. So that's what we've been seeing in the second half of this year. And again, over 2013 and into the early part of 2014, you can see here this huge decline in the labor force, and that was contributing to a sizable percentage of the overall drop that we've seen between 2012 and the early parts of 2014 as well. Now, this is very positive because increases in the labor force means that people are more optimistic. They're seeing more job opportunities. They're getting out there and they're looking for work. So this is a good sign for confidence. And as they become employed going forward, then we can continue to expect to see the unemployment rate tick down, though not as quickly as it has been in the past. Again, because we want to see that unemployment rate come down because more people are becoming employed, not because we're seeing a drop in the labor force. We can put some numbers on that. Again, just to make this clear, look on the right side here. You'll notice that over the last several months, and really going back to 2013, look at our annual job growth figures. They've been very consistent, right around that 2% mark. A little bit of deviation, of course, but relatively speaking, it's been very consistent. But look at these major changes in the unemployment rate, down to 6.4% from 8.2% between 2013 and 2014. Close to 2/3 of that drop came from that decline in the labor force, not from job creation. And of course, beginning in June, we saw it flatten out and it began to increase, and it's currently now at 6.7%. And again, it's jumping around considerably, even though we're seeing a fairly stable job growth rate. So we're moving along in the right direction, and the unemployment rate now, because we have a labor force that's back on par with what we saw in terms of normal growth patterns between 2010 and 2012, the unemployment rate today gives us a much more accurate picture of what's going on relative to what it looked like when the labor force was really low there. So having said that, we're expecting the unemployment rate to continue to tick down in 2015. As I said, currently it hovers at 6.7%. We expect it to drop down to about 6.3% by this time in 2015. what can we say about income? What can we say about income patterns in South Carolina? Well, income is an interesting puzzle, and it's actually the solution to an interesting puzzle that we've been observing in South Carolina in 2014. On the top here, you can see that South Carolina has been consistently growing, or has had employment growth that's been consistently higher than the national average in 2014. If we look at our GDP growth, it's been consistently below the national average over the last year and even before that. So we look at that and we say, well, that's interesting. You might expect that it would be above the national average in both, or maybe below in both, but not one or the other. So what's going on? That's a little unusual. Well, it turns out that income is the answer to this puzzle, or at least one of the answers to this puzzle. So this is the only equation I'll show you today, by the way, I promise. So if we look at wages, what do wages measure? They're just a measure of productivity, right? They measure output per worker. So if we think about output as GDP, and we think about workers, employment, so this output per worker gives us our measure of wages. So if we are below the national average in overall GDP growth, but we're above the national average in employment growth, then it stands to reason that our wage growth is going to be below the national average. And that's exactly what we're seeing. That's exactly what we're seeing in South Carolina. Wage growth that's been consistently below the national average. Now, we'll go back and I want to give you some specific numbers here, going back to the professional and business services category. And this looks at year-end data in 2013. So we can compare the industry sectors within professional and business services. So we have this broad category and we can divvy it up. Employment services is one of those. And you can see that employment services on average is creating jobs that are below the state's average income level, or average wage level, which is about $38,000 a year. Other industries are driving it up. So we can see that this sector, as well as leisure and hospitality, which typically pays at or slightly below the average wage rate in South Carolina, again right at $38,000, the two industries that are contributing most to employment growth in 2014 are not driving wages up. Now, a caveat to that, the employment services sector, this is an industry average, and there's a lot of variation there. So we see positions in manufacturing, for example, that are placed through employment services that are being placed at between $50,000 and $60,000 a year. We also see a number of positions being placed on the low end of the pay scale as well. So there's a lot of variation here. But again, the point is just to show you that if we look at the sectors that are driving most of the growth in 2014, in general, they're positions that are paying less than the state average. We can also see this if we look at, if we divvy up the industry sectors more specifically. Again, won't spend much time here, but just to show you that if we look at the actual number of jobs created, which is the right column, the ones that have generated the most jobs, if we look at nominal income growth, we can notice that the three industries, only one of the three is seeing income growth in excess of the state average, which is listed at the top there, and not by much. So again, the areas that are creating the most jobs, even when you define it very granularly, you can see is generating income growth that's lower than the state average. This is true across the state as well. If we look regionally, Charleston has briefly exceeded the state average in 2012, but for the most part, we've seen consistently income growth consistently below the state average at the regional level. And this is our personal income forecast for 2015. Again, we expect very similar rates of growth as to what we saw in 2014, right around 2% and slightly declining throughout the year. So finally, I just want to conclude. I'll make a couple of comments about housing markets. Dr. Crow is going to mention this more specifically. But as I mentioned, this is one sector that has not come back. And Dr. Crow is going to talk about that specifically. But housing prices have. And that's contributed in a positive way to household net worth. And so this has been very positive for our state, despite the fact that we've seen new home sales that's been fairly flat. If you look at the second quarter, year over year, new home sales growth, construction been fairly flat, even though housing prices have been appreciating. And we can see other methods of economic stability here as well. In housing markets, the employment permit ratio has been fairly flat across most markets, which is another sign of stability. So single-family permits are forecast for 2015, expected to be very similar to what we've seen in 2014. So what are the keys to driving wages up? I'll conclude on this point. There are two ways to focus on. Number one, as I mentioned before, manufacturing. South Carolina is leading the Southeast among all states in terms of our growth rate in manufacturing, adding new jobs. And we've seen good paying jobs in South Carolina too. You can see that wages have been growing since 2003 over the last decade in the manufacturing sector. And then the knowledge economy is very important as well. If we look at the high-tech sector, this is the area of the U.S. that, of all regions in the U.S., the high-tech sectors across the country are where we're seeing the most robust income growth. So that's very important too, and it has huge knowledge spillover effects. So it pays to be a college graduate, but it also pays to work with them. In areas where you see large amounts of college graduates, there are significant knowledge spillover effects, and that generates additional income growth as well. So to sum up, South Carolina has really hit its stride in 2014. We expect that to continue into 2015. If you like this year, we expect that you'll like next year as well. Consumers are in better financial shape than they've been in since 2008. They have more disposable income, which is a major plus for economic activity. We're seeing that particularly in the high concentration of leisure and hospitality in Myrtle Beach. Our long-term hiring practices are changing, and there are a number of reasons for that. And a European slowdown is really only the major threat that we see right now in terms of our forecast for 2015. So I will stop there. Thank you for your attention. And if we have just a moment, if anyone has any questions pertaining to this particular, our outlook, I'll take them now. But we're also going to have a period at the end where everyone can chime in too. We'll have all of our speakers respond. So any questions now? All right, well, thank you all. And we now want to move on, and I'll introduce our next speaker, Doug Woodward. We've been working on a study for BMW. I've mentioned that manufacturing has been a major generator of jobs over the last 4 years, and BMW has been a big part of that. And they've become a real bedrock in South Carolina over the last 20 years. So we've looked more carefully at BMW. And so Dr. Woodward's going to present that research today. So I will introduce him now.
Okay, thanks, Joey. Welcome, everyone. What do you think of our new building? Yeah. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I feel like we're being upgraded from coach to business class, finally. You know, I've been here 28 years, and, we did a lot of outlook conferences back in the old Moore School. And you know what? The dean doesn't know this, but I'm going to take credit for us all being here. And here's the reason why. About 10 years ago, a Board of Trustees member was in my office, and it was raining, like today, and the rain started leaking into the office and started dripping into my office, and I said to him, wouldn't Darla Moore be embarrassed if she could see the state of this building? And he said, you should go and talk to her about this. And then I had another member of the Board of Trustees come by, and I had a wasp nest out there. This is up on the 6th floor. You know, it was a nice building, beautiful view, but the building was really falling apart, and the wasps could actually get inside. And they saw that, and I said, you ought to go talk to Darla Moore about this. But the final reason was, I think there were 5 members of the Board of Trustees that were coming down from the old Lumpkin room where we used to hold the Outlook Conference. A lot of you remember that. And they were coming down and got stuck in the elevator. And that sealed it. That, now $110 million later, we have this great facility. So it's just wonderful to be here. I'm really excited about it. The whole facility is nice. Well, in addition to 2014 being the year that we opened up the building here, see if I can get my slides up there. Okay. Hold on a second. Oops, going back here. Oh, I see. It looks fine. It doesn't look. It looks different on the screen. Anyways, in addition to 2014 being the year that we opened up this building, it's also a milestone for our state. It was 20 years ago that BMW had rolled off the assembly line the first automobile assembled in South Carolina in many years. In fact, in 2014, they also committed to invest another $1 billion over 2 years, the next 2 years in Spartanburg County, so it continues to build out. This is a great example of a company that under-promises and over-delivered. When they first came to South Carolina, they promised about 2,000 jobs would be created. And we did an impact study that Joey mentioned this year. We're going to show you the kind of job effects and other income effects that BMW has in our state. Well, as I mentioned, BMW was the first to make cars in South Carolina starting 20 years ago, but actually a lot of people don't know this. We had an automobile plant. And that was from 1916 to 1925. We had Anderson Motors. They were the most successful car company in the South at that time. It was a custom-built car. They even had one called the Ultra Sport. Think of the names that we have today. Things haven't changed that much in 100 years. But it was the Model T that put an end to this. Because of Henry Ford's production line, the mass production, they couldn't keep up anymore. These were expensive cars and not for the mass market. And when Ford took that over, everything changed. So fast forward about 100 years, and this is what we're making today, the X Series that everybody knows about. Whereas the Ultra Sports, the Anderson cars, we only had, I guess we made about 2,000 a year in South Carolina. This year, BMW has announced that they're going to have the capacity to make in South Carolina 450,000 passenger vehicles in this state, and that's tremendous. It's one of their biggest, if not the biggest, manufacturing facility that they have in the U.S. So this is great news for our state. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the manufacturing renewal that is definitely taking place. You could see from some of the figures that Joey was showing you, and I'm going to emphasize that in my remarks today. But I want to talk in particular about the resurgence of the automobile sector and how that's compensated for our tremendous loss of the textile cluster. Then I'll present some top-line results of our BMW impact study, which is really just incredible, the kind of impact that they have on the state, and relate that overall to our state's competitiveness. So manufacturing, Joey was talking about this, manufacturing matters in this state. We are a state where the share of South Carolina's share of manufacturing is in the second highest quintile. In fact, it's near the top of all states in terms of the share of our economy in manufacturing. About 12% of our job base is in manufacturing. That's higher than North Carolina, for example. The highest is Indiana, which is roughly 17%, and then you can see the Great Lakes region, that is our manufacturing belt, but see how that spreads into the southeast. So we're part of this large section of the country that really depends on manufacturing to do well, and it is. So that's why we focus on manufacturing a lot. I know agriculture is an important sector in our state. They all claim $20 billion industry, and that's true. Tourism, another number one industry. Everybody wants to be number one. We've got a lot of number one industries. But manufacturing is one of the biggest drivers of the state's economy. In fact, what you can see here is kind of interesting with manufacturing. These are manufacturing jobs in our state. And you have to question, is there really a renewal or renaissance taking place here? The job base was steady through about 2000, 2001 in terms of manufacturing. BMW started producing in 1994, but we were losing a lot of textile jobs and apparel jobs and other manufacturing. So it was pretty steady. We didn't lose a lot of jobs. And then something happened in 2001. And it happened really across the country, but we really felt it in this state. We lost from 2001 to the depth of the recession 125,000 manufacturing jobs. That's a huge blow. Now, what was it in 2001? Well, there's been academic research on this that shows, and it confirms what I've been finding is true, is that's the year that China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and got duty-free access, most favored nation status, access to the U.S. market. And as a result of that, a lot of manufacturing migrated out of here, set up shop in China. We lost a whole furniture cluster in North Carolina, for example, just one example. Textiles, after that, there was pretty much the death knell. We still have a textile industry in this state. I want to emphasize that. But in terms of job generation, nothing like it was previous to that time. And so you see that huge drop. But this is the renaissance. It's turning around. Since the depth of the recession in 2010, we've created about 30,000 jobs. Things are going in the right direction. We need that momentum to continue. Now, Joey showed you this slide before about manufacturing and the contribution that it makes to employment growth in the most recent period in the recovery that we've been having since about 2010. Manufacturing has been a big generator of jobs, but I want to say that it's more important than it even appears when you just look at the share of manufacturing, because manufacturing jobs also support a lot of jobs in professional and business services. You mentioned the employment services. That's just one example of that, but a lot of professional business services are creating jobs as a result of the demand for manufactured products in South Carolina that then creates a ripple effect on these other industries. That's true even of leisure and hospitality. Manufacturing pays good wages. People take vacations. Often in this state, they take vacations on our coast, and we know that's doing well right now. Myrtle Beach and up and down the coast, Charleston, the Low Country, has benefited from the manufacturing job base that we have even in leisure and hospitality. TTU, that's transportation, trade, and utilities. Trade, for example, is wholesale trade and logistics, transportation, utilities. All of those generate significant amount of business from manufacturing. And then finally, the government, too. Let's not forget, manufacturing pays good wages, so people are paying taxes, property taxes, income taxes, sales tax goes to our state. In addition to that, manufacturers are actually taxed on their property at a very high rate, the highest of any, unless they get something called a fee in lieu of taxes, a tax break, to help bring that down, to level it out a little bit. But my point is that manufacturing is affecting all sectors of our economy. Now, what's leading this renaissance, this revival of manufacturing in the Southeast and in South Carolina is primarily, but not exclusively, but I want to focus on it today, automobile sales. And you can see why things weren't going well during the recession, where people were buying cars at a rate we hadn't seen, despite population growth, all the way back to 1980. Now we're getting back up to normal levels of annual car sales, vehicle sales, as you can see. We want that to continue, and it looks like it will. It definitely will for next year. So this is really good news, and that's what's generating the demand and the production here in the Southeast and in South Carolina. Here's the states that benefit from that. Look at how it goes right down the center of the country. This is what we call the auto alley. These are the states that have a higher share, a high specialization on automobiles relative to their share of the overall economy. It's called a location quotient. So a high location quotient over 1 means you have a specialization in this industry, autos. And these are not counties and they're not states, they're called BEA, economic regions. You can see South Carolina picks up a piece of that, but we're kind of detached from the auto alley a little bit. And I'll come back to that in a second. You see Charleston and then the upstate are the two parts that have mostly benefit from having demand pick up in the auto industry, because we have a high degree of specialization in manufacturing in the auto sector. But that's really quite dramatic. You see, it's the Great Lakes down through the middle of the Southeast. That's because it gives, you're away from the East Coast and the congestion and the high cost of the East Coast, and yet near to major markets. Lower production costs and easy transport access. And that's where most of the new automobile plants have been built, in this auto alley, but especially in the Southeast. Now look at this. The red are the foreign-owned plants. The blue are the big three domestics, Ford, GM, and Chrysler. See how they've all clustered and concentrated, with one exception in Texas, in the Great Lakes region, the Midwest and the Great Lakes region. That's where the big three cluster is. The Southeast is the cluster of foreign-owned plants. Of course, there's Volkswagen in Tennessee. There's Mercedes in Alabama. I could go on and on, but all those red dots are the assembly plants. And we've got this one sitting over here, connected to this overall large regional cluster of automobile plants. So when autos pick up, this whole region is doing well, and this is where most of the new investment and expansion, just like BMW, is coming into the Southeast. So we did a study this year of BMW's economic impact. There's the 20-year anniversary, 2 decades of economic development. It was really interesting to step back, because I think it takes 2 decades before you can really see, is this paying off? And yes, it is. Now, we're not the headquarters of BMW. Of course, everyone knows that. The headquarters is in Munich, in Bavaria. I'm actually with some other professors taking students over there in March to look at what a really strong auto cluster looks like. Southern Germany, Bavaria. It's incredible the amount of innovation. I like to refer to it as the Silicon Valley of the auto industry. There's so much new innovation coming out. They're in the forefront of all kinds of, both in terms of production as well as electric cars and composite materials. A lot of research, highly sophisticated engineering taking place in Bavaria. So we're linked to that region. BMW actually operates around 30 sites in 14 countries around the world, and it's continually expanding. I've seen their operations in China. That's also pretty amazing. But right here in South Carolina, BMW has just done an incredible amount of good for our economy over 20 years. As many of you know, it's located in Spartanburg County, right on the border of Greenville County in Greer. It's the only manufacturing assembly facility. I said in North America. They actually have opening one, I believe, in Mexico. So I should say in the United States now. That just changed this year. But they've had many expansions. Again, they under-promised, over-delivered. They had something promised on the order of $500 million of investment. Now there's like $5 billion of investment and more, and continues in South Carolina into this factory. This is where they build the custom cars, the X Series. It's the only facility that makes the X Series in this very agile, adaptable production plant. It's really a model of modern 21st century production. And what's also interesting about it, if you didn't know, is that a lot of this is exported. And that's where we're a little different from these other southeastern states that have picked up these plants. We are the export, because we're close to the coast, and this is connected to the port of Charleston through rail lines. I'll come back to 70% of their output is now exported around the world. And it's really good to have the X Series. It initially was producing the sports coupe, the Z Series, and that's somewhat seasonal. This is more of a steady, year-round production, and there's demand everywhere for this car, from Saudi Arabia to China, back to Europe, and across North America. So it's a good model to be making here in South Carolina, and that's where BMW has concentrated this activity. So here's the impact. Going across the top, what you see are the major outcomes that we measure in economics to judge the success of any investment that takes place in our state's economy. We have a model to do this, and we estimate the effects, in this case of BMW, on our job base, on employment, and you can see on income, because we were talking about before, obviously that's very important to other businesses, because that income is spent in the state and then generates additional business activity throughout South Carolina. Then there's something called value added. That's equivalent to our state's GDP that you've all heard about, gross domestic product. That's a good measure of its contribution, its net contribution to the state's economy. And then there's finally economic output, which is the overall measure of their impact, or the total value of production produced in that plant. So I'm going to focus first on the total impact. As you can see, 30,000 jobs. Now remember I said before, that we had a renaissance. We turned the corner on the job base and created 30,000 jobs since the depth of the recession. I'm not saying this is what BMW did, but this is how many jobs that they account for now in the state's economy. If they were to shut down tomorrow, heaven forbid, we would lose almost 31,000 jobs. We'd lose $1.7 billion in labor income, $2.8 billion going down, looking at the value added, and it's $16 billion in output. That's what a big effect it has on our state's economy. And to look at it in positive terms, this is the real contribution of BMW, and it's hard to find anything else, any one single entity, any other single business that has that kind of outsized impact in South Carolina, and that's why it's something we all should be very happy about, the decision that was made 20 years ago. Now let's look at employment and just break it down a little bit. Remember how I said this affects other industries, and it's not just manufacturing. As you can see, that there's about 7,600 direct jobs in BMW now in the upstate, but then they also generated an indirect impact on our employment base, and that is a result of the supplier network. All right, so when BMW purchases from local suppliers, just South Carolina suppliers, there's about 40 of them, they generate jobs as well. And I show you 13,444 are generated in South Carolina. Then there's an induced impact as well, and that's when the workers at BMW, as well as the suppliers and other businesses that are impacted by BMW, spend their wages in South Carolina and support these other businesses, everything from retail trade to tourism. These businesses would lose a lot if we didn't have BMW. 9,679 jobs induced by BMW. And then you add those all together, you get the total impact, 30,000, almost 31,000 jobs. Again, that's enough to call it a renaissance. BMW started a renewal, a renaissance in South Carolina that lasts to this day. Here's some multipliers. You don't have to, really write these down or anything, or memorize them. But I want to show you one thing about this. We look at multiplier effects, because that's what I was showing you before, how these direct jobs lead to these indirect jobs, to these ripple effects throughout the state of South Carolina, through this indirect and induced effect, giving this total ripple effect. That's how you get the multiplier, which is the ratio of the total to the direct effect. And it's autos up there. BMW has a multiplier about 4 that has the highest multipliers in the state of South Carolina. That's why these plants matter to us. They create bigger spillover effects, knock-on effects throughout the rest of the state, compared to other industries. Cotton farming, 1.4. I don't mean to pick on the arts, but museums, 1.7. They're important to our state, but they don't have the kind of impact that a manufacturing facility like BMW is going to have. Highest multipliers that you're going to find. It's no wonder we subsidize them, and to some degree, with infrastructure improvements and working with them on their taxes so that they do stay in South Carolina, so people are generating income and then are returning to the state money through their own taxes. So, in wrapping up, I just want to show you some of the other facts. We talk about this in our report, and it'll be up on our website today. BMW benefits beyond just what we can quantify and just what we show through the multiplier effect. It significantly enhanced our technological capabilities in the state. It shows that South Carolina can do globally competitive manufacturing, and that sends a message throughout this country and throughout the world. It draws attention to our state about what our capabilities are. It also strengthens our overall supply network, and the auto cluster is really the nucleus of our auto cluster through the supply network. I'll come back to that in a second. It's also upgrading our workforce development. It's doing some really innovative things, and we need this with workforce development. And the auto cluster in particular, but BMW especially, is doing a lot with the workforce to make sure that we have the right skill set for 21st century manufacturing. Being a German company and a leader in environmental sustainability, in fact, BMW is #1 in its sector, automobiles, in sustainability, is ranked around the world by Dow. Dow Jones is a leader in environmental sustainability, and they're bringing those practices here to South Carolina. And finally, they're also promoting research and development. A lot of you might have heard through CUICAR, which is located at another university in this state. That will go unmentioned. But that's good. We like that. That they're putting that kind of technological capability and research into South Carolina. Here's the supplier network. What you see is most of the suppliers for BMW are clustered around the plant in the upstate, but we do get some supplier effect in the Midlands, as you can see as well, as down in Charleston in the Low Country. So there's really 3 separate core areas that are doing automobile production. And this is true of the auto cluster generally. You find a similar sort of pattern that's built out around this. And a lot of these suppliers, they do business with BMW. They also get business elsewhere from outside the state with other assemblers in automobiles. All right, so that's just one thing that BMW does. It shows how it spreads across the state. Now, I want to just return briefly to the sustainability benefits. This BMW complex, it's a whole campus upstate, shows our state that you can be environmentally progressive and responsive and economically successful. There's a profitable plant by putting in innovative sustainability practices. For example, it sources 2/3 of its energy from methane gas, which is derived from a nearby landfill in Greer. The project has really substantially reduced greenhouse gas emissions in South Carolina and sets a higher bar for sustainability for other firms. BMW has also created the world's first green automotive paint shop. It's powered by this recycled methane from the landfill, and it also has the first plant in the U.S. to use water-based instead of toxic high solvent paints, uses water-based paints. Those are just some examples of what they're doing. They're doing a lot of other innovative things. A lot of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are used in the plant around there, reduces more emissions. So again, it shows that you can be economically successful and environmentally progressive. A good message for South Carolina. Now, finally, I just want to say that what makes this work is that BMW works with the state in a partnership that's helping our state in the 21st century prepare for a new renaissance in manufacturing. One example of that, which opened in 2013, is the inland port. And that allows the output from the factory, as well as inputs, supplies coming into the factory, to travel to and from the Charleston port along a rail line, a Norfolk Southern rail line, in just a few hours, and that takes trucks off the road. BMW and the other firms that use the inland port are projected to reduce truck traffic to the port by more than 25,000 annually. And anybody that drives up and down 26 knows how great that is to hear. This is the kind of innovative thing we're doing with infrastructure. We need more of this. Another good thing that BMW is doing in partnership with South Carolina is help prepare our workforce readiness. South Carolina has now getting a lot of attention for its apprenticeship program. The South Carolina Technical College system, there's been many articles just written this year on how we're in the forefront of apprenticeship programs run through our tech system. The first, BMW works with this, and of course the Germans are known to have this apprenticeship system, and that's one of their real successes. And they're bringing that to South Carolina. They have a segment of the program that's called the BMW Scholars. They had their first classes in 2012, 2013. All have been hired as full-time employees out of the tech system. All right, serving now is a model for what needs to go on elsewhere in manufacturing. All right, so the bottom line here is BMW creates competitive advantage for the state of South Carolina. It brings in capital investment. Under-promised, over-delivered in terms of capital investment, up to the tune of $5 billion plus. Employment, 30,000 jobs, helping spark that renaissance in manufacturing. This strong and growing supplier network in our state. The sustainability practices. And last but not least, probably as important as anything, it creates this enhanced image for our state. Our state's image is intertwined with BMW's brand, which is the most, it's the most respected brand by a lot of agencies that rate brands in the world. And we're able to help our state attract other businesses as a result of the good things that they hear about what's happening with BMW in South Carolina. So that's really where I want to conclude, except to say one thing, that we want this manufacturing renaissance to continue. Now, after our break, we have one of the leading experts in the whole country on manufacturing, so please come back for that. We're going to take about a 10-minute break, but I want you to hear Sue Helper tell you what else is happening in manufacturing around this country and how it relates to South Carolina and our cluster development, okay? Well, we want this manufacturing renaissance to continue. I think it can. So thank you very much. We'll have time for questions at the end of the program. Okay, well, next up, as I said in my remarks, we're really excited this year, and we really thank Sue Helper for joining us today. She's the Chief Economist for the United States Department of Commerce, but really, Sue is well known to all of us in academia who do work on manufacturing and economic development. She's known for her work on auto supplier development in the United States. Right now, she's on leave from the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western University in Cleveland, where she's a Carleton professor of economics. She'll return there next year, but the last year or two she's spent up in Washington as the chief economist with the Commerce Department. She received her PhD in economics from Harvard and her BA from Oberlin College back in Ohio. So please join me in welcoming Sue Helper to the podium.
Great. Well, thanks very much, and thanks for that fear-inducing introduction. Is that what I said, fear-inducing? And how do I make this go? about the outlook for manufacturing in the U.S. and argued that the outlook for manufacturing in the U.S. depends on two things. So one is the general U.S. economic outlook. Only about 20% nationally of manufacturing output is exported, so we really need to be generating most of the demand for manufactured goods here in the U.S. And the second factor is competitiveness. How well are we doing? How much do we import? How much do we produce for our own domestic consumption? And the punchline is that both are showing kind of steady and modest improvement. So not so much different than the picture for South Carolina. Then I want to talk briefly about what is it that we actually make in the U.S. It turns out to be quite a lot. And how can we make more of it? And I'll talk then specifically about some policies that we're introducing nationally to increase the competitiveness of manufacturing. So I'm going to go over really quickly some of these fortunes of the national economy because other speakers are going to cover that as well. But just to point out that we've had a really good run of job growth, basically the longest run of positive job creation numbers in history, so 57 months and counting. And so along with that, the unemployment rate is falling, so down to 5.8% in November, still too high, but much better than the numbers in excess of 10% that we saw in 2009. We've seen consumer attitudes improving, and so a kind of, again, positive picture. One thing that hasn't or has just barely started to move, and Joey talked about this for South Carolina, is real wages. And I think this is concerning if we think about what's the point of an economy. It's to provide a good standard of living for the average person. And so we can see a kind of long-term stagnation in wages, where if you look at the blue series, which is the long-running series that we have of data, this is for something called private non-farm production and non-supervisory workers. This is about 80% of the workforce. And that number actually peaked in terms of an hourly wage, or it includes some salaried people, but expressed as an hourly wage at back in the 1970s. And so we saw a big decline in the 80s, some increase over the 90s, and then beginnings of tiny little upturns in the last year or so. So this is something that is quite concerning, and something that some of the policies I'll talk about aim to improve. One of the reasons that, I guess it cuts both ways, one of the reasons that we haven't seen a lot of wage growth in the past is unemployment has been relatively high, and workers don't have a lot of bargaining power when there's unemployment, particularly with the decline of unions. One of the reasons that the economy has been slow to recover is that government's been a drag on the economy. You know, we kind of rail a lot against government spending, but the flip side of that is that when government doesn't spend, there's less pump priming to go on. And we've seen this particularly in the case of state and local government, where I wanted to get this figure. During this 57-month streak of private sector job growth, state and local governments have shed about 380,000 jobs, including 180,000 in education. So to the extent we're caring about upskilling our workforce and preparing for the jobs that we want to have in the future, these are problematic trends. And so then are actually seeing that the holding back of government, this holding back of government, slowing down of government is actually holding back the economy. A factor that's been kind of so-so also is the trade balance. We've seen a continuing and increasing surplus in services, a declining deficit in petroleum, and then a slightly increasing deficit in everything else, which includes manufacturing. The positive story for manufacturing are this chart looks a lot like the South Carolina chart of a long-term decline with the big drop in 2001 that Doug mentioned. and then a kind of a blip upward. So 700,000 new jobs in manufacturing since 2009, which is really a change, a real structural change. The last two recoveries, even when the economy recovered nationally, we saw continued decline in manufacturing. And so the fact that as the economy recovers, manufacturing is right there with it, that's really good news and some sign of some structural changes in the way that manufacturing is able to compete in the economy. So we're seeing some acceleration in 2014, both the manufacturing and the non-manufacturing sector. So this is, I guess, a kind of a suggestion that in terms of the part of demand for manufactured goods that depends on having a strong domestic demand, we're getting there, slowly but surely. This next part of the talk that I wanted to focus on more of was kind of what do we make in the U.S. and how can we make more of it. This is a chart from a recent report that my office did on what do we make in America, or what is made in America. And what it shows is of the total demand for a product, so if we think, looking at the first thing here of food and beverage and tobacco products, about 80% of the domestic demand is composed of domestic content. So for every dollar that we spend on food, beverage, and tobacco in the U.S., about 80 cents of it's made here. Another second point here might be motor vehicles. So about 42% of domestic of demand, total demand, is produced domestically. And the length of the bar tells you kind of how big the sector is. And so even though the motor vehicle sector is not a super high domestic content industry, because it's so large, it really accounts for a lot of employment, a lot of value added. So this report's on our website. It's a lot of really interesting numbers about how to think about what we actually make in the U.S. So we make a lot of food, beverage, and tobacco, a lot of motor vehicles, a fair amount of petroleum, computers, etc. There have been some structural changes in U.S. manufacturing and over the last decades. And I think the way we think about manufacturing and policy hasn't always caught up, even though these changes have been occurring for a few decades. The canonical manufacturing, old kind, behemoth you might think of as Ford Motor Company. So in 1920s, Ford was this very domestically oriented and vertically integrated company that basically owned iron ore mines in Minnesota, mined the ore, stuck it in Ford-owned ships, went through the Great Lakes, landed at the Ford docks on the River Rouge, and 3 days later, a finished Model T exited the other end of the factory and was sent on its way. We don't see that so much anymore. Now about, for every one worker that's directly employed by an automaker, 4 workers are employed in the supply chain. So that's the first change, which is a rise of supply chains or outsourcing. And the second change is globalization, and that we get much, much more of our manufactured goods and other kinds of output from abroad than we used to. And so one of the things I think this does, one of the ways this has an impact on policy, is it creates more potential for the government to act as a catalyst to nurture what economists call spillovers, where one actor, one firm or something does something, and that benefits, in the case of training, or hurts, in the case of pollution, another firm. And firms are likely, as economists point out, a profit-maximizing firm typically doesn't take into account benefits that it provides to other firms when it decides how much of something to do. So from the economy-wide point of view, an individual firm trains too little because they aren't going to pay for training for some, or they're worried that if they pay a lot for training, then their employee can be poached by someone else. So what this means then is more and more of the economy is in these separate firms, that there's a real role for government to both kind of prime the pump and deal with these spillovers and to convene to get agreement. This is a direction that we all want to go in. And so this is a very different approach, I think, to manufacturing policy than what was sometimes criticized as picking winners or losers. It's not like we sit there in Washington and go through a list of industries and, oh, we like that one. No, we're trying to think about spillovers. How can we maximize these spillovers and step in where the market fails to produce the kinds of investments that really would be productive? So there's 4 kinds of spillovers that we can think about in manufacturing. So the first one is investment in basic research. It's something we've done a long time. A second is technology transition, so getting that technology out of the lab into the market. I'll have a bit more to say about that. And then supply chain health. We have a lot of companies that depend on a tier of shared suppliers. And there's some recognition of the importance of this. So, for example, Alan Mulally, the head of Ford, went to Washington to testify about why the government should rescue his 2 biggest competitors, Ford, GM, and Chrysler. Why? Because if those companies went down, Ford would be threatened because the supply chain would be threatened, or common supply chain. So I have a bit more to say about that. And then training, we could talk about that in questions if you want. To say a little bit more about supply chain, as I mentioned, there's this problem of what economists call appropriability. And what we see now when companies are thinking about their supply chains as individuals is a real underinvestment that I think holds us back, particularly when we compare ourselves to a country like Germany that has all kinds of institutions and all kinds of practices by large companies that create a really strong sector of the Mittelstand, the middle-sized supplier. A survey I did back in my academic life found that if you look in suppliers, the auto supply case, you find that even by their own admission, barely half of companies by their own admission do preventive maintenance. So they're not able to necessarily guarantee that they're going to have uptime, that they're going to be able to get a return on investment in expensive equipment. By the way, this equipment's really old. We've seen that, in fact, equipment in manufacturing is at its oldest age since the 1940s. So we're trying to have this renaissance, but based on equipment that's aging. We also see a relatively low innovation capacity nationally in the auto supply chain, and in general we see that R&D spending is really quite skewed. So just for this auto supply sector, half of the auto suppliers said they spend less than 1% of sales on R&D, and less than 10% of sales come for products or processes where they innovated in some way. So these are, I think, concerning and suggest that there's some underinvestment that we need to do something about if we want to continue this manufacturing renaissance. There's a number of great underlying factors that give us a chance to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., but we need to really take advantage of those and capitalize on them. So that brings me to my next point, which is, or my next topic I want to discuss is how can we actually make more in the U.S.? And I want to talk about the 3 kinds of policies that promote positive spillovers. I want to talk about clusters, I want to talk about applied innovation, and then finally high road production. So in each one, I'll highlight just one policy. For clusters, it's the Investing in Manufacturing Communities Partnership. For applied innovation, it's the National Network of Manufacturing Innovation. One thing when you spend time in Washington, you like these long words and acronyms. I really thought I had gone overboard when I found myself. I had a sentence with about 4 acronyms, including the verb. That was really bad. And then the last one I want to talk about, and I'll say what I mean by high road production, but it's a tool that my office developed called Assess Costs Everywhere that basically helps companies and also local governments think about finding hidden costs and hidden value from production locations. So first thing I want to talk about is clusters. Clearly you have the beginnings of an automotive cluster here and many aspects of it. And stronger industry clusters have been shown in working paper by Delgado, Porter, and Stern that they have significantly more growth in employment, wages, patenting, and new industries. This might be kind of surprising because there's a rap about clusters that you can, you'll be stuck. If you specialize in one, you'll be stuck and it'll be hard to build on others. But what's different about a good cluster is that you have a lot of shared assets. So there's some kind of glue that holds even separate companies together, whether it's a training program, a university research program that they all contribute to in some way, some kind of supplier upgrading mechanism. All these things can then lead to the skills that create a new kind of industry, a new ability to develop something. So in Michigan with Detroit, you're also seeing not only the resurgence of the auto industry, but the rise of what they call automation alley. So there's a lot of robots used in factories. There's in a lot of industries and startups making those robots and programming them, etc. So what I think the challenge of this thinking is that I think particularly in maybe less dense areas of the country, there's a temptation for a firm to think, I want my labor force to myself. I'm going to have one factory per interstate exit. I don't really want to be competing for a labor force with anybody else. I want to go and find some greenfield town where, as one OEM put it, they'll have a ticker tape parade, when we open our factory. But there's some hidden cost to that, which is one of the big benefits of a cluster is a real exchange of ideas and innovation that comes from just serendipitous exchange and problem solving. So the big example of this, obviously, is Silicon Valley, one of the most expensive places to locate in the world, but yet high-tech firms feel that they have to be there for the conversation that occurs. And so one thing that I think is really important, if we think about some of these nascent clusters in the newer manufacturing areas, is the increased density. It's good for environmental reasons, as Doug said, but I think it also will help promote ideas exchange, also help promote the kinds of training and bargaining power improvements that will lead to some wage increase. There actually is a lot of clustering in the U.S. These clusters remain. But I want to focus on our policy here, one of our policies to promote clusters is the Investing in Manufacturing Communities Partnership, IMCP. The idea behind this is to create a race to the top in economic development. So the idea is you build on historic strengths and sometimes repurposed. So one of the winners in our inaugural competition was Rochester, which built on kind of the ashes of Kodak and Xerox to develop a cluster in industry so new it doesn't really have a NAICS code, which is photonics, optics, precision machining. But to build on something that means that you're different, that you're not competing head-to-head with another community. So when you do that, then you're left often in a race to the bottom with increasing tax breaks that make it increase the tax burden on ordinary people and or reduce the ability to offer services that can create both a good quality of life and a competitive environment. A second thing that we're committing to do, and it's been really heartening to see, is a interagency cooperation. So Commerce has the lead for this program, but we've gotten great input. If you go to the IMCP website, you can reach by going to EDA.gov, the Economic Development Administration website. you'll see a playbook there that has all kinds of great tips for building a cluster. This playbook was actually developed largely by EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. We've had a lot of help and assistance from USDA. So the idea is, let's work together in government, avoid duplication, coordinate our efforts, just as we're asking communities to do. So that's kind of one of several, but I think the most important and newest, so therefore most important, policy that we have around clusters. And as I said, we announced 12 winning clusters last year. The new federal funding opportunity will be announced momentarily in the next few weeks. A second market failure or area where the government can encourage spillovers, I mentioned, is in this area of applied research or getting things out of the lab and into markets. And there's a lot of spillovers here where one company, for example, can figure out how to use a new process. In the case of the very first one of these, which is, let me tell you what it is, and then I'll tell you why it solves a market failure. It's the National Network of Manufacturing Innovation, and this has been funded. About 4 of these institutes have been stood up already with money from existing departments. So I like to say money from the Department of Defense and Department of Energy couches, that they were able to scrounge a few dollars to put together these things so that companies can cooperate, a little bit of kind of pump priming money to bring companies and universities together to explore things like 3D printing, which was the pilot. And so, for example, you see there's standards. The materials behave differently when you run them through a 3D printer than when you say, machine them. You use traditional subtractive methods. Each company could figure that out for itself, or we could set up a system or a place where people can collaborate and do joint research, do it once, share it, and really increase efficiency. That's what this does. And very excitingly, in the recently passed Omnibus bill is an authorization for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, part of NIST, to set up more of these centers. So hopefully this will move from our authorization to appropriation, but it's a very exciting development. The last thing that I wanted to mention as a policy is what we call the ACE tool for Analyze Cost Everywhere. And this is the website that is my office. And what it does is it allows you to affirm to understand some of the hidden costs of being offshore, having a far-flung supply chain, or to flip it around, the hidden benefits of building close to where you sell. And one of the key things actually that we found is there's a calculator for inventory that we developed in conjunction with Suzanne de Treville, professor at MIT and University of Lausanne. And one of the things that she pointed out is that we often underestimate the cost of long lead times because we ignore the critical factor that when lead times increase, the volatility of the forecast also increases. So you have to cover more contingencies, which means more production. So often companies will make 3 times their median demand to make sure that when they hit a demand peak, they've got product. And so that one factor by itself can lead to a 20 to 30% cost saving if you come back, produce in the U.S. where you can actually know what demand is going to be before you start the production line. So it's a really important tool. I urge people to try it out. It's very simple. Only need about 3 or 4 pieces of information, and acetool.commerce.gov. A second piece that is important in this tool is, in general, the idea of hidden costs. We often think about wages directly. The things we measure are actually pretty small costs in manufacturing, and often have a different interpretation. So wage costs on average in manufacturing now are 10 to 15% of total cost. Most of the cost is in the supply chain. So if we think about, can we compete on the value of our supply chains, the value of our workers, rather than trying to compete, say, with Mexico or China on how low we can make wages? Can we actually increase our productivity, increase our uptime? The tool begins to at least lay out some of the ideas about how that can go. I was going to have an example, but I promised 25 minutes, and I'm 30 seconds over, so I will conclude. And just to kind of talk about where we've been, I think we've shown that there's slow but steady growth in the U.S. economy. This is one of the factors that's helping manufacturing, and helping manufacturing especially because, as Joy pointed out, it's not clear that the rest of the world is going to be growing anytime soon. So that's one factor that's helping us. A second factor is this increased competitiveness based on some realization or increasing realization of the power of collaboration in things like clusters, in things like competing on value and not price, things like working together on applied innovation. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to take a couple questions.
Any questions for Sue? She's going to have to leave after her presentation, so we're going to have time for Q&A at the very end of the conference, but here's the time to ask Sue any questions you have based on her presentation or any other comments you have. So I have a question, actually. It has to do with cluster development, very important in our state. We have a Council on Competitiveness, a cluster organization, and been working on this for over 10 years, looking at how to develop clusters. I just wondered, as I look through what Commerce is doing in Washington, do they have, are they doing studies of comparative clustering around, like who's really doing successful, even globally even, we're a global business school, so we're always interested in what are we doing right, what are we doing wrong, how can we find best practices within different kinds of clusters, something we could learn from in this state.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the Economic Development Administration, part of Commerce, has partnered with Michael Porter at Harvard Business School and there's a cluster project that has a very useful ability to kind of put in a cluster and see what it looks like across the nation. And so it was the study that I cited about the causal linkages between clusters and wage employment and new industry growth comes out of that project. And so you can actually compare the automotive cluster, say in South Carolina with that in Tennessee. Right now it's just the U.S., but there's a work well underway to make it a North American cluster. Mm-hmm. One thing I would point out, though, that I think is different, and as they've constrained clusters to be the same. So it's the same 4-digit NAICS codes in every cluster, and that may not be how you want to go. So, for example, the auto cluster in Michigan has a strong machine tool component. The one here does not. Mm-hmm. You may not want to, exactly do what someone else has done. In business, often you want to compete in a slightly different way.
Okay, thanks. Is there any other question here?
Yes. Thank you for your very informative presentation. My name is Carlton Dallas. I'm with the Hilton Head Island Economic Development Corporation. One of the interesting points in your presentation is about you are suggesting we should not be chasing smokestacks and what have you, which is a good point. Tremendous amount of pressure competitively with other municipalities and government organizations to provide incentives. Can you speak a little bit more to how we avoid that smokestack chasing?
Yeah, it's not easy. So I think there's several things that can be done. One is nationally, to the extent we can return to full employment, there'll be less need to kind of compete over the few jobs that there are. A second thing I think is for municipalities to figure out what they have that no one else has. So Hilton Head, you've got, incredible beaches and weather that, Cleveland doesn't have. On the other hand, we got a great machine tool and polymer sector. But I think, and then thinking about these hidden costs and benefits, and the extent you can really compete on value, not price, so that, yes, our workers make a little more, but that's because they're really fully trained and your uptime is going to be incredibly high, and because that expensive equipment is always working, you're going to make really a lot of profits. I think that's the model that Germany has worked on in Germany, and to do a little bit more of that in the U.S. is one direction to move on.
Another question back here. Yeah, go ahead. Maybe you can just speak.
Okay. Dr. Harper, I wonder, many of us have been around for a long time looking at the business models for the United States, particularly see a lot of things that change the traditional model from maybe a long-term viewpoint of R&D and investment, this kind of things, to maybe part of the private equity and the hedge funds, and a lot of it having to do with our economic circumstances. That it's a lot more focused on short-term profitability, high leverage, and those kind of things that work against a little bit of a long-term viewpoint. And I wonder what you might think about that.
Yeah, I think there's two problems there. And to some extent, yeah, you see people sacrificing long-term prospects for short-term. And I think the second kind of issue is what sort of long-term growth story are they willing to tell? So the private equity will actually invest, for 10 or 15 years in pharmaceutical development, because there's a story they believe that they're going to ultimately get about a profit, that some of these drugs are going to hit. To the extent that we can, this is one of our goals with the ACE tool, to tell a story that says building a manufacturing sector with highly skilled workers and suppliers is also a way that you're going to get some long-term profit. That's one set of things. I think another set of things that we need to do nationally is to think more about how do we make sure that when companies make profit, they're making profit because they're doing something really good as opposed to financial manipulation. And so I think that's an area of work for the administration and the next administration. So I guess my 2 points are, one is we need to improve policies. A second, I think, is awareness and better data. That often these decisions really are made based on very, very poor data, that what's measured is wages. And so people tend to think that if you're paying a higher wage, your cost must be higher. In fact, that's not true. We can look at Germany, for example. So to the extent that the national government, state and local government, we can actually talk about the kind of investment and the payoffs to investments in workers and small business, those would be another kind of thing that we could do. But I agree, it's a serious problem.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So I just want to tell you, when you go back to Ohio, you should know there's an affinity between your state and Hilton Head Island. In fact, they have a bumper sticker, OHIO, with a capital HI for Hilton Head. You see that all around. So keep coming back down and enjoy our great weather.
My brother spent many a spring break driving.
Doing that route,
so
yeah.
You definitely got your cluster there.
Yes, tourism, right. Okay, well, I hope you're okay with this. We're running a little bit behind, but as you can see, our speakers have a lot to share with us today. Our next speaker is David. David Crow is the chief economist. We're going to talk about housing now, moving away from manufacturing, another important sector, but one that's been struggling a little bit, as everybody knows, in South Carolina, just as it has around the country. So we're really pleased to have David today. He's the chief economist and senior vice president at the National Association of Home Builders, where he's responsible for their forecast of housing and economic trends, which he'll be sharing with us today. They do survey research and analysis of the home building industry, so nobody better to talk about housing and how it's going to, what we can expect for the coming year, 2015, than David. Before joining the National Association of Home Builders. Dr. Crow was with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, among other roles that he played in the federal government. David holds a PhD in economics from the University of Kentucky. Okay, David?
Afternoon. Good. We're still alive after so many economists in a row. I applaud you. So one more. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm very excited about trying to give you my piece of the overall economy, that of housing. I've sort of got 4 different pieces to give you, and then I actually will give you a forecast. I'll venture out into that field of trepidation where we actually try to tell you what we think is going to happen. So a little bit about the macroeconomy, and I think this blends very well with what you've already heard. Oddly, I don't think there's a lot of disagreement here. Unfortunately, you're not going to get a duke out with different economists. But to give you my background, my way of looking at it, and why I think it's important to the housing sector, particularly employment. I will again emphasize that, just as the previous speakers have, because I think it's such an important and critical component of moving forward in housing. Look a little bit at house prices and affordability, because there's been a lot of discussion about is that a good thing or a bad thing, and where's it going. Certainly there are still some headwinds out there. There are some reasons why housing isn't moving forward. I want to touch on those, and then I'll finally give you my forecast. So first of all, the macro. This is kind of what every economist sort of starts with. This is where we begin. This is the overall economy expressed in growth rates and gross domestic product. And there's really only a couple points I want to make here. Number one, explain the outlay. The gray areas are the recession, particularly the most recent one where you see negative growth, a loss in productivity and a loss in output. And then that red vertical is the separation between history and forecast. So everything to the right of that red is my forecast. And so there's really only 2 points to be made. Number one, the recovery has been uneven. So you see that those bars going up and down. There's no real consistency there. A little bit of that happened after the early 2000s recovery as well. But if you were to go all the way back and look at the recovery from the early 1980s, that was really the more classic recovery. We had this huge snapback effect and a very large collapse in the economy, the biggest one to that date since the Great Depression, and then a consequent very large recovery from it. Not the same this time around. The fact that the housing sector was the one that suffered the most, and it was typically the one bringing the economy out of the recession. Without its aid, without its stimulus, we just had this erratic growth rates. A couple of decent quarters. In fact, if you look back in history, some of those decent quarters align with the end of those home buyer tax credits. If you recall, they were in and out. They almost would expire, and then the Congress would extend it again. But at each of the potential deadlines and the ultimate final deadline, we got a boost in housing to capture that tax credit. But unfortunately, because the economy still wasn't strong enough to gain from that spark, to be able to use that spark of house consumption to further the rest of the economy, it just stole consumption from a future quarter, and so you got those ups and downs. Now, and I think Joey mentioned this very well, because the households have corrected a lot of their balance sheet issues, because net worth is improving, because we're expanding job opportunities, all of those things are finally dissipating most of those dark clouds. And so we actually are beginning to see some real movement forward that can be sustainable. So that's why you see that forecast that has a nice positive growth rates, in the plus 3% rate for the next few quarters, certainly into 2015 and on into 2016. The other big issue about macro and housing, of course, is interest rates, and particularly mortgage interest rates. Obviously, in a classic sense, the lower the mortgage rate, the more likely you are to see people buying, maybe not only buying, but buying bigger rather than smaller if they have low mortgage rates. So, yes, we've had these extraordinarily low rates. They popped up right after the Fed announced that it would start reducing its purchases of mortgages. And then we've since enjoyed kind of a flight to safety benefit where a lot of the international investment has moved back to the U.S. because of all the uncertainties in the rest of the world. So we've seen this, I would call momentarily lower rates. The slide before this suggests that we're going to have higher mortgage rates, because if we have an expanding economy, a continually expanding economy, that's going to eat up capital for other sectors, and that is going to drive up mortgage rates. So I think they will drive up at a relatively slow pace. So even by the end of 2016, as you can see, I still have mortgage rates below 6%. All of that aside, I have to say that I think the level of mortgage rates is not the key to the housing recovery. It's the availability of mortgages. Yes, sure enough, a lower rate helps, and there are some people who can just barely qualify at a 4 that wouldn't be able to qualify perhaps at a 4 1/4. That is true, but the bulk of housing consumption right now is being deterred because so many people can't qualify at all, regardless of whatever the rate is, and that has a lot to do with overly restrictive underwriting standards. I'll get to that in a little bit later, but I just want to say, yes, rates are low, and yes, rates will go up, but I do not think that's a significant deterrent or restrictions to ultimate housing demand and ultimate consumption. Employment, make the same point, I think, that Joey made. Number one, for the U.S. and for South Carolina, we are above the last peak. South Carolina just barely, U.S. a little bit more than that. I think the one interesting thing here, if you look at comparisons, is that the South Carolina dipped a little bit more. So at the worst, the low was 91% of the peak in South Carolina. At the lowest, the low was 94% of the peak in the rest of the country. But in either case, they both have come back up to, in the case of South Carolina, about where you were at the peak, and in the U.S. a little bit beyond that. Again, that's not enough. If you look at those dotted lines, the trend line, we're still off of that. And that makes sense. Okay, so we have created as many jobs as we had at the peak in 2007. But think about that length of time. During that period, a lot of individuals aged into the job market. And so we have to have a lot more jobs to be able to call ourselves fully employed at the same level. So we still have 2 or 3% growth yet to make up before we're back up to where we ought to be. And why is that important? Because employment drives housing. I am in housing, so I care a lot about that from that standpoint. Here's just one way to exemplify that. Well, every one of those dots is a state. And so it simply says that the faster the employment is on the vertical, and this was growth rates since the last peak, the faster the growth rate in single-family permits. And so there's a nice solid, those dots are really clustered close together. That correlation is very tight. We've got one outlier in there. It's the one everybody likes to, at least if you're in housing, the one everybody likes to refer to. North Dakota has this outrageous growth in both employment and single-family construction for 2 reasons. One, it has benefited from the exploration boom, in particular, even more so than some of the other states. But more importantly, these are percentage changes, and it's a very tiny state. So even some relatively large numbers in percent terms make a big difference. But South Carolina, right in the middle of that correlation. So that's why I emphasize employment. It's why employment is a big deal. Is because it could clearly drive what housing construction is. And it's quite different. So you can see why there's a scattering of states. So some states have not had a very large increase in employment, and as a result have not had a very large increase in construction, and the converse is true, of course, as well. It's even true, the relationship isn't quite as tight, but it's even true if you look down at the state level and look at individual metropolitan areas. You have the same general feeling, those metropolitan areas, those marketplaces that have seen the strongest growth in employment since the beginning of this recovery have seen the strongest growth in single-family permits. Unemployment, of course, you've heard this before. Unemployment rates are not the best indicator of where we are because we've had so many people drop out of the labor force altogether, and so the unemployment rate isn't a good indicator of where the economy is. But there is one way in which I would use it, and that's simply a relative differences. So number one, again, only two simple points out of this graph. Number one, it's come down for every age group. They have improved. It's been better than it was at the worst. But number two, the young people are still suffering from a higher unemployment rate than everyone else. Why do I draw your attention to that? Because young people are first-time home buyers. Think about it for a minute. You can trade all of the existing homes you want. You can even trade someone from an existing home to a new home, but it doesn't change the overall demand for more houses. It just changes who lives where. You need first-time home buyers, and in my case, again, I look specifically at this industry, more first-time home buyers to expand the ultimate need for more houses. So that's a real elementary condition about home building, is more first-time home buyers. Since they are mostly young people, they still suffer from a higher unemployment rate than the general population, and therefore they have been less participating than everyone else. The other way you can create more housing demand, of course, in addition to more first-time home buyers, is simply have more people here. And so, fortunately for South Carolina, you have always, at various degrees, always benefited from in-migration. That's a kind of a subtle deduction from this graph. I'm simply saying, where's your population growth relative to the rest of the country? Now, of course, one other way you can get strong population growth is by having a lot of children. That's typically not been the case most recently. Birth rates are very low. And so that indicative, it must mean that you have a lot of in-migration. Job growth has another indication that that's been true. What about prices and affordability? Well, first of all, South Carolina didn't suffer quite the rapid rise or rapid fall as the rest of the country. At the worst, South Carolina was only 88% below its peak, and it is now about at the same relative sense, 92% below the last peak. The rest of the country is 91% below the last peak. We're about in the same age range. In other words, your prices right now, these are indexes. This is the FHFA index. You're back to about what you were in 2005. That's kind of not a typically much different for the different metropolitan areas, except perhaps for Myrtle Beach, where prices still haven't come back again. Not an unusual situation in a highly resort area where a lot of the prices are dependent upon second homes or rental properties. The other three places where there are price indexes from the same source are about up to this 91% of where they were at the peak. But they still haven't ruined affordability. So this is an index that the NAHB developed several years ago. Really, it's a simple index. It says, of the typical household, and we use median income to represent a typical household, how many homes that were recently sold can that typical household afford? So we look at the last quarter's worth of sales, both new and existing homes, and say if you have a median income in this case we have numbers for Columbia and Charleston are the only two metropolitan areas for the South Carolina. In Columbia, the typical household in Columbia can afford 77% of all the homes recently sold. In Charleston, 64% of all the homes recently sold, and in the country as a whole, 62%. So you would consider anything above 50 to be good. If a median income household can afford half of all the homes sold, you're at least in a hold steady situation. Everything above that, you're in a good place. So even with these recent house price increases, affordability is still in a good state. One thing that may gradually change the minds of these first-time buyers who are now still not first-time buyers, in fact, they are renters, virtually all of the young people that have formed households have gone directly into renting instead of a share of them buying their first home. But one thing that will move them away from that is the rising rents. So this is unfortunately a U.S. number, but it's happening in most markets. That graph and that index basically can be interpreted to say that rents are rising at about 1% faster than everything else, than all other prices. And over time, that means ultimately a young couple with paying a $1,200 rental payment will finally say, wait a minute, I can pay $1,200 for a monthly payment on a mortgage and gain equity as well. So while there is a large tilt towards renting right now, particularly amongst those eligible to be first-time buyers, I think that one of the forces behind changing that will be rising rents. What are the headwinds? Well, the first one is this lack of participation by the first-time home buyer. I want to go back to that one more time. So normally they buy over 40% of all the existing homes sold. That's their dominant market. It's cheaper than a new home, and there's much more availability. There's four or five existing homes for sale for every new home. Over the long run, it's actually even a higher percentage right now, while the new home market continues to struggle backwards again. First-time home buyers are only participating at about 29% of that market instead of the typical over 40%. In the new side, they usually buy about 30% of the new homes. Now they're only buying about 16% of the new homes. And then finally, this isn't as complicated as it looks. There's really 3 points to be made out of these two pie charts. First of all, let me explain what they are. The left-hand side is an average of the 2000s, at least the 2000s before the complete collapse. And the right-hand side is the most recent information I have from the American Housing Survey. The left-hand side is bigger than the right-hand side, so that's the first point. What total home sales, new and existing, are smaller. Over 5 million during that boom period, some not boom, some of the early part of the 2000s as well, 4 million now. Second point, 20% of all the homes sold were new in the earlier period. Only 10% of all the homes sold are new in this period. The third point is the subtle point. It's that little white arrow. During the earlier period, the first-time buyer of existing homes allowed that existing home owner to sell their home, and half of them bought a new home. So that's, again, why this first-time home buyer makes such a big difference, because not only the direct buy, which used to be 20% of all sales, but also the indirect buy that allows the existing homeowner to purchase something, and in about half the cases, they usually purchase a new home. Now shift to the right-hand side, that's cut in half, more than half. So now we have the first-time buyer buying existing homes, but about only 20% of those existing home sellers were buying a new home. So we've lost new home sales from two purposes, from two sources. There is some good news out there. There's some reasons why we're seeing some improvement, so I don't want to leave it completely dismal. Real income growth from the peak to 2013, so the entire period from the best to what we are now, was negative for every age group except above 65. And so income growths have not been positive for everybody through 2013 if you compare it to the peak. If you compare it year to year, and it's the same point that I think Joey was made about how if you look at more recent periods, we are beginning to see some improvement, and in fact, improvement even amongst the very young. So, I mean, part of the reason the improvement is because they got kind of a low spot to start with. But nevertheless, it means there are groups of young people who are finally seeing income increases that will give them the encouragement and the ability to move forward into home ownership. Some of the other issues that the builders are facing are supply issues. And think about it this way. You saw the collapse in the auto industry. The overall auto industry went to production about half of what it was at the peak. It went from something like 16, 17 million units to about 7 or 8 million units a year. Housing went to a quarter of its peak. So yeah, the auto industry suffered, but it was nothing like what suffered in the housing industry. The only reason you really don't hear about it is because there's no behemoth out there. There's no big one corporation building houses that went out of business and had to be rescued by the federal government. Instead, there was a very, very large number of small family businesses that went out of business. But that included all the supply chain as well. And so one of the problems is lot inventory. Lots are usually created by people that that specialize in development. They specialize in bringing raw land up to the point of being able to build a house on it and then selling it to a builder in order to do that. Well, and that's a long process. It can be 3 or 4 years to get from raw land to being able to build a house on it. So 3 or 4 years ago, things looked pretty bleak, and there wasn't anybody out there developing land. And if there was, if they were smart enough to realize that things would eventually turn around, they couldn't borrow any money because the banks were saying, we don't want to have anything to do with real estate. So as a result, we've had a shortage of lots. What this picture depicts is the gray area is total housing production. Over 2 million at the peak, collapsed to about 500,000 at the trough. The bars are the share of builders that said they're having a problem getting lots, that they're suffering from a shortage of lots. And it's a classic economic explanation. As the market started rising during that boom period, you saw those bars growing in height. More and more builders were saying, yeah, I'm having a trouble getting a lot because I'm competing with my peers. In the collapse, nobody was having trouble getting lots. There was an excess of them. The banks were taking them back. So we had a very few. The concern I have now is we have a very tall bar, builders saying they're having trouble, and yet, look, we're only halfway back to where we should be in terms of production. So we're out of balance there. Same thing with labor. Not quite as dramatic in terms of that explanation with demand and supply, but it's the same kind of thing. In fact, we ask these questions periodically, but just that, whenever we feel it's worth asking, and we didn't even ask the question about labor shortages in the collapse because it clearly was not a problem. But we had that, you can kind of see the same sort of rise in labor problems with the industry rising, fall, and then now again, a little bit of out of line with where the process is. Credit is another issue, credit for the buyer and credit for the builder. So in the case of the buyer, we asked our builders, have you lost a sale because the consumer could not qualify for a mortgage? Last year, over half of them said that. This year, 44% said that. So it's not as bad as it was, but it's still bad. Now, I'm not saying that we lost 44% of our sales. I'm saying that 44% of the builders lost at least one sale because of the inability of the buyer to qualify for a mortgage. And that is basically because we've tightened up these underwriting standards to excess. As is typical of Washington, D.C., if they see a problem, they're going to solve it so well that we've swung the pendulum in the opposite direction. Same is true of builders being able to get credit. Slightly different problem. There it really is a reluctance for most banks, which is where most builders get their development money. And so I won't try to give you an explanation of this particular picture, just to say that it is getting a little bit better. That rising, particularly in the construction loan area, has alleviated some of that problem. It's not gone away, but at least has given the builders a chance to get back in the market. And then the final headwind is, as I mentioned, because so many of these production processes disappeared, they collapsed just like the building industry itself. It's taken a while to get them back in line, get their production process back, get their employees back, get their facilities open again. And so that has boosted the prices of some of the more elementary materials in building because the capacity isn't there yet anyway. So given that that's where I think things are going, I think hopefully you've gotten the impression that we are getting a little more stabilized. We are beginning to see a lot of the problems disappear. We are beginning to see some confidence come back. We have a lot of pent-up demand that did not take place because of that hiatus. And so I think we'll see some decent recovery. I have three pieces of the industry: remodeling, multifamily, and single family. The remodeling didn't collapse as much. The drop from peak to trough isn't as big, partly due to the fact that we had tax credits for energy conservation that helped keep the bottom up. We also had a lot of substitution for moving. Instead, people remodeled. So they decided selling my house and buying another house is just too dangerous, too complicated, too uncertain. But I do need, a new kitchen and another bedroom, whatever, and so they remodeled. So that kept the floor up. And in fact, we're kind of getting back up in a real sense, real expenditure-wise, to about where we were before. So I have kind of an evening out of remodeling, a little bit growth. The multifamily side, that's been the star of the housing show. as I mentioned, so many of these young people that have established households, even though it's a smaller number than should be, smaller number than the population would suggest, those have all become renters. And so we have had a huge surge in multifamily. We're back up above where you would consider that to be the last normal, 340,000 a year. We're well above that. But I do think we're finally getting to where the sustainable level is. So I don't expect to see a lot more growth in that. And in fact, I have that same expectation for South Carolina. Not quite up to where you should be, not quite up to this new level of demand because of the excess demand for rental over home ownership. So you have a little more growth left in the South Carolina economy. Single family side, still only halfway there in the country as a whole. Still struggling to get back. Some movement forward, and believe it or not, we are twice where we were at the bottom. So, we bottomed out at somewhere a little over 300,000 units a year. We're up to around 600,000 units a year. So we at least have gone a long way, but that doesn't say we are anywhere near where we need to be. We're still only halfway back again. I do think, and this year's not been particularly stellar, we only probably will see about, I think a 6% is what I have now, 3% growth in overall single family this year. The latter part of the year much better than the early part of the year. But still struggling to get at least above the 2013 levels. But that also says there's a lot of pent-up demand. There's a lot of reason to believe that we should have a much better year next year to make up for some of the losses we've seen this year. And same thing for South Carolina. A little bit further along in your progress, so I think you're about 78% of the way there. So this robust economy that you've had, this strong employment growth, has created a better scenario for South Carolina than it has for the country as a whole, and because you weren't quite down to the lowest levels of the rest of the country. So your trip back to normal is not quite as far. Individual markets, widely different, and that's even more true if I were to look at the country as a whole. This is slightly different comparison than the slide before. This says, where are you respect to normal? And in my case, normal is what was the annual production in those markets in the early 2000s compared to what just got done in 2013. So the state as a whole is 74% of the back to normal. The United States, as I mentioned, is only 48% back to normal if you use 13 as the standard. But one of the reasons, I guess, behind Myrtle not doing so much so fast is because they're already producing more than they did in the early 2000s. Not that early 2000s isn't always the appropriate yardstick to use, but I use it for everywhere because at least it gives you a consistent comparison. In fact, I'll do that for the whole country. Looking forward to 2016, where will those states be relative to normal? And it's again, South Carolina is already well on its way and will certainly be past normal by the end of 2016. We still have this Rust Belt, if you want to call it that, this manufacturing center of the country that suffered so greatly from the collapse. And that was not a housing collapse like the sand states. That was an employment collapse that they still will not be back to normal even by the end of 2016. On the other hand, some of those sand states, Nevada, California, less so for Florida, because they fell so far, even though they're improving, even though they're getting better, they just have a long trip to go. So even they still lie at the lower end of that spectrum in terms of getting back. A couple of resources for you for sometime later, particularly the eyeonhousing.org. It's a blog that myself and this is a self-promotion advertisement at the end of my speech, that we publish 2 or 3 times a week to kind of give you a sense for what we read in what's going on in housing. I thank you very much for your attention. That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, David. We have time for some quick questions before we introduce our last speaker today. A lot going on. Here we go.
Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac just announced that they would accept low down payments matching FHA. Considering what we've just been through, do you see that as positive or negative?
I see it as very positive, but not a dramatic change. First of all, they were accepting 95% LTVs up until the announcement. Now they're going to 97. So it will help a few people that don't have or cash short, and 93% down payment they can make it, 5% they couldn't. The biggest difference is that FHA has had to continue to raise its premiums, and so that Fannie and Freddie's low down payment loans will be a little more attractive because they won't be quite as expensive as the FHA. But they're still very tight underwriting standards. So this isn't the mistake we made back in the 2004, 5, 6 period was layering risk. So not only could you get a low down payment loan, but you didn't have to justify your income, and you didn't have to justify the appraised value of the home, and a series of other layered risks that really were the cause of the problem. A single risk, VA has made no down payment loans for ages and had a very, very good, respectable default rate even through the disaster. So low down payment loans in and of themselves are not where the problem is. It's when you multiply the risks.
You mentioned that new homes are being bought by first-time home buyers in the last year at a rate of 2% compared to a normal rate of 8%. Does any of the, in previous years, does any of this have to do with changing demographic trends and the desire of younger people to live closer to downtowns where most of the available product is either older or rental?
Some. You know, I can't say that the millennial generation for more socialization, more urban living, less car transfer, those things probably have something to do with the reduction in their purchases of new homes, since typically new homes are out on the edge, not always, but often in the green fields. If you look at preferences, however, most young people still prefer to own a home. And so that downtown living is more a temporary situation in which they don't have the savings, they don't have the job security of being in the same place long enough. And I can't deny that what's recently happened is going to affect their decision in the short run. But I am not one who believes we have gone through some looking glass and that all young people are going to live downtown and not own a car. I don't think that's true.
Any other questions?
Do you see any decrease in the average size of new home starts?
No, the opposite has happened, actually. The size of new homes has been growing, but that's, again, it's a manufacturer of the situation, because only those with better incomes, with more secure jobs, longer in their careers, are able to qualify for a mortgage. Only those are the ones out in the marketplace, particularly for new homes. And so they naturally tend to be those that already own a home and want a bigger home. So new home size has actually been increasing, but it has more to do with the mix of who's buying than it does with some kind of general desire for larger homes. I suspect once the first-time home buyer comes back into the marketplace, we'll see that trend reverse.
Okay, well, thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Good luck.
Okay, our final speaker this afternoon, I'm pleased to say, is one of our Moore School graduates. He's Robert Key. He's Senior Vice President for CCM Investment Advisors. He's going to talk about the finance sector. We've talked about manufacturing. We've talked about housing now. One of the sectors we're always a little nervous about is what's going to happen with the financial markets, what's happening with that industry. So that's what Robert's going to address. Robert began his career in the finance industry with South Carolina National Bank as a credit analyst, and then as a corporate banker, and later moved to First Union Bank, where he started and managed the private banking group right here in Columbia. With CCM, Robert's responsibilities include management of client portfolios, marketing, finance research, and fixed income strategy. Like I said, Robert is a graduate, has an MBA from the University of South Carolina in 1982, and like Joey, you went to undergraduate school at Furman. Okay, Robert?
Thank you, Doug. Am I on? Okay, good. we've heard from a lot of different folks about other areas of the economy, so I'm going to kind of focus in on the outlook for the financial markets. So with that in mind, I want to talk about what we're thinking about the bond market to start off with. Then I'll cover stocks. Then that'll lead into a discussion of the financial industry. And then we'll drill down a little bit deeper into the local and regional credit markets. And I have to say that the events of last week have made me do a little bit of adjustment, on the fly with some of the slides that I've got. But, in some sense, that's good because it's helpful in assessing what our outlook is to step back from some of the noise. But, I will try to put in some updated statistics here. So first, let's start off with bonds. Now, just a little tutorial, going back to my MBA, bond market returns represent the sum of fixed interest payments to capital gain or loss resulting from fluctuations in market values due to yield changes. And third, variations in the credit risk premium that amount that investors demand in terms of yield for taking on additional risk. Now, because the yield change has the greatest potential and is the largest factor in bond market returns, any forecast of future returns really has to start with an outlook for what we expect, how we expect yields to go. And so just as a little reminder to everybody, as interest rates go up, the value of a bond goes down. And as interest rates go down, the value of a bond goes up. So it comes as no surprise to anyone that yields are at the, at historic lows. So let me see if I can. There we go. So the blue line represents the yield on the 10-year Treasury, a peak of 15.8% back in 1981. The red line is inflation. So by any stretch of the imagination, it's just come down a long way. I had said that the 10-year yield was 2.189%. That's last week's data. It's down to 206 as of the end of yesterday. And I'm not sure exactly what it's done today, but it may have come down just a little bit more. But the real point of this chart is that there's not that much more room for yields to go down. So you can really say that we're really somewhere near the end of a 35-year bull market for bond investors. But as we look out, the real question then becomes, okay, that's where we've been, where are we going now? So to get to that, we have to kind of step back from our historical path and forget about reversion to the mean and really ask the question, what is going to drive interest rates? So financial theory tells us that a nominal interest rate, a nominal yield, is the sum of a risk-free rate of interest, an inflation premium, and third, a credit risk premium. So let's set aside the question of what the risk-free rate is and accept that that's the U.S. Treasury yield for right now. And let's focus on inflation, and let's focus on credit risk. At this point in time, we are really not seeing a lot of inflation risk in the market. In contrast to what we were seeing in the late 70s and early 80s when inflation was quite high, inflation now is really not that much of a factor. But the best market indicator of inflation expectations is the spread between the Treasury, inflation-protected security, or Treasury, or TIPS, and the conventional Treasury yield. So if we look at the 10-year Treasury yield, we'd subtract the yield on the conventional Treasury, or subtract the TIPS yield from the conventional Treasury yield, and that gives us a market expectation of inflation. So this chart shows you the 10-year yield, which is that blue line, and then the TIPS spread is the red line. And you can see that that green line represents roughly the median over that period, that 10-year period. And you can see we're somewhere right around the median. In fact, we're actually kind of trending down. And TIPS yield as of yesterday was 162 basis points, which is that's getting pretty far down there. But the message really there is that the market is not expecting a great deal of inflation. So that's our best estimate of what, or investors' best estimate of what we think inflation is going to look like. But, we certainly don't find anything to dissuade us from accepting that premise. So, not a lot of inflation risk. Let's talk about credit risk. As Treasury yields have plummeted since the end of the recession, investors have gone through a wrenching realization that yields just simply weren't or not available that as they were previously, and that if they wanted to achieve certain levels of income, they were going to have to compensate for that in some way. So there are really a couple of choices there. You can either extend maturity or you can accept additional credit risk. So we're going to talk about credit risk. Now, we model credit risk by subtracting the 10-year Treasury yield from the 10-year BAA corporate yield. And as you can see, back in 2008, credit spreads spiked, and that's, of course, because the world was coming to an end. Lenders didn't want to lend money, and bond investors did not want to buy bonds, particularly financially oriented paper. The red horizontal line represents a very long-term equilibrium premium, and then, of course, the green line is the actual spread. And you can see since 2008, credit spreads have contracted. That's really not a great surprise. But looking back at that, that's great. But let's try and look forward beyond where we are there and kind of say, where do we go from here? So we've talked about the risk-free rate, talked about inflation premium, talked about credit risk, but I guess there are really three other fundamental points that we've got to look at in terms of interest rate path. And one is the Federal Reserve policy. We continue to have a very accommodative Fed. Commentators may accuse Janet Yellen and the Yellen Fed of a lot of things, but tight-fisted monetary conservative is certainly not one of them. Yellen is clearly cognizant of the Fed's mandate on employment. And so in our opinion, until employment gets down well into the fives, deeply into the fives, that they're going to continue to place an emphasis on that in policy. Item number two involves supply and demand components of the Treasury market. On the demand side, U.S. debt continues to be a very popular destination for foreign investors that are drawn by the safety and security of U.S. debt. As the European economy continues to be soft, ECB policy is going to be accommodative. That drives very low yields in Europe. I think the Bund yield is 0.67 as compared to our 2.06. That has the effect of investors looking to the U.S. to lock into higher yields. And we don't see that changing. Furthermore, a domestic event is the advent of liability-driven investment policies by pension plans that now seek to immunize their pension portfolios so to prevent risk on the corporate balance sheet. That stimulates a demand for longer-term treasuries. So you've got this groundswell of demand for treasury securities. Then on the supply side, while we still experience a fairly sizable federal budget deficit, the growth of the federal deficit is certainly decreasing. So there's a diminishing supply of treasuries out on the market. So you've got this increase in demand and softening supply growth, and that all leads to some pressure on price, drives price up, yields go down. Okay, third item, and this is really, I guess, a 5-month item, and that's the collapse of the price of oil. Number one, obviously, gas and oil prices are a factor in inflation. We talked about inflation being a factor of yields. So, directly or indirectly, that's going to have an impact on yields. But I think, in addition, that collapse in the price of oil is going to put the Fed in a position of being a little bit more accommodative than they might be otherwise. There are some concerns about, once we pierce the $70, $80 level, now we're down to sub-$60 levels. There are some concerns that maybe oil prices going down will be not so much stimulative to the economy, but maybe may have a drag effect on the economy. So we'll see how that all plays out. But nonetheless, I think from a yield standpoint, that's going to be bullish for bond investors. So in the final analysis, we look for a modest upward drift in rates somewhere, over the next year or so, somewhere, perhaps a trading range on the 10-year Treasury of 2% to 2.75%. We started out the year at a 10-year Treasury of 3%. We may get some drift back after that. But I think the real important point here is that we don't see some catastrophic increase in yields. That I think, for anybody that went through that period back in the 80s, you tend to think, well, that's where rates are going to go. But that's not where they're going to go. At least there's no data to indicate that. Okay, let's talk stocks. S&P performance over the last 5 years. What a bull market. I mean, what a run. If you weren't down at the bottom, you're hating life because you missed out on a heck of a run. 210%. We've given up 4% over the last 4 days, but still a very, very good run. Compounded annual growth rate of just over 21%. Heck of a run. I guess the question is, going back to that, being able to step back from where we've been and forget about reversion to the mean, the question now is, where are we going? So let's once again look at the fundamentals of stocks and see if we can project out into the future just a little bit, see what the next couple of years might look like. So to begin, equity valuation really is represented by two factors. The first factor is a stream of income, and I'm going to define a stream of income as dividends and earnings reinvested back into the company. And then the second factor is the value that investors place on that stream of income. And that's, the first one is relatively easy to, at least it's tangible in the sense that you can place a number on projected earnings. Factor number two, that discount rate's a little bit squishier because there's interest rates involved in that, but there's also a psychological component that investors place on it, and that is their risk aversion. But let's start off with the more easily quantifiable number, and that's earnings. Our view of the world is very similar to what our other speakers have spoken to. We think that the domestic economy may be reaching what we might call escape velocity, where it can survive without support from accommodative fiscal and accommodative monetary policy. We've been through this period of 2% and 3%, and that seems to be the consensus forecast. It's not a very satisfying growth rate. It doesn't get us real high employment numbers. But the good side of it is we haven't had a dramatic spike in GDP, which also inevitably results in a fall off of GDP. So we've had this sort of tepid kind of 2 to 3% growth rate, which isn't, once again, isn't very exciting. However, it is it's very positive for stocks in producing income because it does provide some degree of predictability for company management as they decide, how to proceed with their business plans. So, while not exciting, that's a pretty stable growth platform for investors to build an earnings forecast. So, number one, earnings. Number two, equity valuation. Equity, or the discount premium, is based on basic, number one, interest rates, and then also what we loosely call the equity risk premium. So starting with interest rates, we think rates are going to be relatively stable, somewhere in that 2 to 3% range on the 10-year Treasury. So really the question then becomes, well, what sort of risk premium are we going to assign to that? And that's where it gets a little bit squishy. But fortunately, we've got a pretty good measurement tool for risk premium, and that would be the PE ratio on either individual stocks or the broader stock market. If you think about PE as an equation, you have price over earnings. We've identified earnings. So the question is, how much of a discount ratio are we going to place on that earnings stream? So, a PE of, say, 20, if you take the inverse of that, that implies a discount rate of 5%. So, and we've got a pretty good measurement tool for PE ratios historically. This slide shows you what we've looked like, really going back, I can't read this, but it's 1977, so pretty long-term shot of what PE ratios have looked like. And you can see there are some there's a major spike during the Clinton era. The chart I graphed this against political administrations, which I don't really pay a lot of attention to, but it is kind of interesting. Makes you wonder what people were smoking during the Clinton era, but because PEs obviously got really high. It was a good ride. Unfortunately, the downside, the buzz wore off. But anyway, I guess really the point here is that PE ratios, the market PE is roughly about 15 at this point. But from an historical standpoint, that's really not that far out of line. The long-term average is 13.7, 15, not a great divergence there. PE ratios can vary dramatically depending on earnings and without any sort of change in investor psychology. So the difference between a PE of 15 and a PE of 13.7 isn't, in our view, isn't statistically significant. Once you start getting down to the lows in the far left-hand side of the chart or the highs up in the middle of the chart, that's when you start taking notice. But right now, we're comfortably somewhere in the middle. So, given that, there are really two scenarios. If earnings increase and PE ratios stay the same, that is, the discount rate stays the same, we should have a steady rise up in market prices. If, on the other hand, earnings collapse or earnings go down and PE ratio stays the same, discount factor stays the same, you'll see, a slow and steady decline in prices. If, on the other hand, the discount earnings stays stable and the discount rate changes because of a change either interest rates, but let's hold them constant for right now, but more importantly focus on investor psychology because we've had a pretty good example of that change in the last week or so. If investor psychology changes and investors increase that risk premium that they assign to future earnings, you're going to see a decline in prices. And that, in our opinion, that's really what's happened in the last week or so. There's been a great deal of fear about what low oil prices may do for the broader world economy, and that's why we've had this reversal in the stock market. We think that's a relatively temporary event, and we think that investors will work through that. I don't know exactly what's going to happen to the price of oil, but we think investors will get beyond this fear. And we kind of see, somewhere, in the inflation plus 3 to 4 or 5% kind of range for 2015, a steady earnings stream, no collapse in the PE ratio. So kind of a comfortable ride, I guess, maybe 6 to 8%. With perhaps some volatility, and we'll see. But no great collapse anticipated, but also no great upside. We had the great upside last year, and once again, I hope we were all there. But we don't think that's in the cards. So, okay, broader stock market view. Now let's just drill down just a little bit deeper into the financial industry, and we'll talk about that and what we see in terms of banks and insurance companies and general lending conditions and forecast for financial stocks. And then that'll take us into a little bit of touching on the local and regional economy. Low yields have been a very challenging environment for the financial industry, specifically insurance companies and banks. The finance industry does cover other subsectors, but I'm going to focus on finance and banking. Banks and insurance companies make money lending money, but they also make money investing into their portfolios. And as low yields come to the marketplace, and primarily those intermediaries are invested in fixed income instruments, lower yields produce less portfolio income. So it's been a real challenge for the industry. As you see, for example, in the banking business, a metric that's followed very closely is net interest margin. That is the difference between gross interest revenues and gross interest expenses. That margin has continued to collapse over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's been very challenging to increase that margin. That's really the only way that banks will make more money. In this very low yield environment, it's a challenge. They are unable to increase portfolio income by extending average maturity portfolios because they have to maintain asset and liability matches. And anybody that lived through the S&L crisis of the 80s knows that if you let that match get out of whack, it's not a pretty scene. So really the only thing that's been available to lenders is to increase credit risk. And we have, in fact, seen that. And I go back to this slide that we saw earlier. You've seen the difference in this. This is measured in the corporate bond market. But that's also reflective of non-public markets, the bank and insurance market. But, you know, anecdotally, we also hear that. I was talking to some of my colleagues earlier, former colleagues, I should say. And we've certainly seen it. We've certainly heard it. And that banks and insurance companies, or at least in the commercial and corporate world, are opening up and taking more credit risk than they were 3 and 4 years ago. You're seeing prices or rates available on commercial and corporate credits that are just stunningly low, and very intense competition for good credits. And more loans are getting tossed into what you might loosely call the good credit category. I know anecdotally we can all tell any number of stories about businesses that weren't able to access the credit markets, and that perhaps were in 2007. But I would submit to you that 2007 was a real bubble, and that there was a lot of lending that was going on, a lot of lending activity going on at that point in time that wouldn't have taken place 10 or 15 years ago. So we're not back to where we were. I don't know that we're ever going to get back to where it was in 2007, but I do think that we've seen a loosening in the credit markets, and that trend will persist. So, you know, as it relates to business activity, if you want to think of availability of credit as a raw material, a factor of production, we see low rates. We see increased access to credit markets, all of which bode well for business activity in our local and regional area. So just to summarize everything once again, relatively stable interest rate environment, possible tendency to, you know, a little upward slide in yields, stable, perhaps unexciting economic growth. That's a positive environment for stocks, along with a stable interest rate environment. And then low yields and improvement in investor risk appetite should continue to open up the credit markets, which is good for local and regional business. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions. Now, thank you for your... Yes? Go for it, Dan.
Low interest rates, businesses chasing free credit, and this kind of thing. Seems like we're setting the marketplace up for some more merger and acquisition activity. What do you guys think about that?
I think that's probably true. You know, any sort of environment where gross profits are constrained, whether it's finance or manufacturing, sets up an environment where mergers and acquisitions is attractive, because that gives companies the opportunity to decrease overhead as a percentage of the bottom line. So yeah, I think we'll probably see some more M&A activity. Not at the upper end of the banking market, though, because there's certainly a constraint on what the mega banks are going to be able to do. That's a regulatory constraint, and I don't think we're going to see any sort of Citicorp, Bank of America type mergers. In fact, I read an article yesterday about Citicorp. Maybe this may be the end of Citicorp as a large multinational lender. They just haven't been able to successfully produce in that model.
Question here.
Robert, as you might know, South Carolina has not done very well in building small companies into big companies, scaling companies, 100 million to over. And a big part of that is access to capital. And what can South Carolina do you think, to address that kind of issue?
That's a tough question, and I'm going to split it into two components. I think that South Carolina's access to venture capital is, that's challenged. I think access to credit's probably pretty good. We've got presence in the state from a real broad spectrum of lenders, from small local banks on up to the biggest of big banks. So I think that capital will find its way to the highest and best use. I think where we're a little bit underserved is perhaps in the venture area, which, if we were over in California, where so many deals are made in coffee shops or in bars, and they're club kind of deals, and money and capital flows very readily to new startups, might be a different story. That's just really not the case here. I don't really have a good solution for that. I don't think that more governmental presence will be particularly useful, because my experience with governmental venture capital type deals is they end up being political in nature, and the access to capital then becomes who has the best access, which is not the highest and best use of capital. Yes?
Should we be careful or fearful of the bond market maybe going forward now as interest rate, they say it's been on a 30-year flat, and think things are going to rise in the future? How do you adjust your portfolio for bonds in the future?
That's a great question. That really illustrates exactly what I'm talking about. And it's the fear that rates are going to go up, if I'm hearing what you're saying, it is so inbred into anybody that's my age, because we've seen that 15, 16, 17% rate on long bonds. And the instinctive thing is to say, we're going to go back there. And we may at some point. The question is, when? And we just, that's really a function of inflation, and we just don't see that, certainly in the next 12 to 24 months. See anything else from Joey?
Yeah. Any other questions for Joey or David or Robert? Well, I have to tell you, Robert, I feel a lot better than when you started your talk about how next year is going to look with interest rates, with the unwinding of quantitative easing and everything. And I feel like that just confirms what Joey was telling us before. We're going to have a good year. Hopefully, it won't be derailed by any shock in the financial sector that we don't know about yet. But thank you very much. Join me in thanking Robert and Joey. And I want to thank all you for coming. And just finally, I'd also like to thank the staff that helped put on the conference today: Robert Appel, Robin Carruthers, Tina Poindexter, Jane Gargothi, David Lund, and Peggy Bennett, and many, many, many more helped in so many ways make this first Outlook conference here in our new building a success. I'd also like to thank again the sponsors. The Dean did that before, but we're really, really very grateful to them. And finally, I think we all should thank Darla Moore for writing that check to make this building happen, okay? And happy holidays to everybody.